between that Act and the Withdrawal Act. I haven't time to go into the details, but the reality is compliance is not just a simple question. It's a matter of grave importance in terms of which law is the law of the land.
Minister. I thank my right honourable friend for that argument, and I think the House will be grateful that I take that outside the House and have a detailed discussion with the right honourable gentleman rather than detaining the House at urgent questions. It appears, Mr. Speaker, that was one of my more popular answers.
Mr. Peter Grant.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I associate myself and the SNP benches wholeheartedly with your remarks earlier on today. For hardened political journalists who went home last night in tears, none of us can feel any pride of what happened. And I say it from my own benches. I've had words with some of my colleagues, and I hope others on other benches have as well. No party was entirely innocent, and it doesn't take us forward any if all we do is blame someone else. But back to the matter of the question, and I commend the honourable member from Edinburgh South for asking it. I think the identity, and if I may say so with respect, the relative juniority of the Minister set in to answer this question, and the identity of the Prime Minister who didn't come to answer the question, maybe tells us more than the answer itself. But can I say to those in the government benches, and I hope they'll take it back to the Prime Minister, if he wants a general election, I'll make this offer to him from the SNP. Bring back an extension that takes no deal off the table, and he can have his general election. But they might also want to advise the Prime Minister to be very, very careful what he wishes for, because his wish just might be granted. What an extraordinary position we're in, for we have to ask questions in Parliament about whether the Prime Minister will obey the law of the land. I heard yesterday a question which to me and to a lot of people seemed to say to the Prime Minister, in a specific set of circumstances where the law specifically requires you to take a very precise action, will you do what the law requires? And I heard the Prime Minister saying no. That is an extraordinary state of affairs. We have not yet had a satisfactory answer as to how the Prime Minister thought that that single one-word answer, no, was not an assurance that he would defy the law. The Prime Minister doesn't want to extend. If the law says to him, thou shalt extend, will the Minister confirm that the Prime Minister will obey the law of the land? And will he also confirm that a Prime Minister who shilly-shallies in any way about obeying the law of the land is not fit to be Prime Minister?
Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I particularly reflect on the comments that there's no innocent parties, and every single member of the House probably has overstepped the line at one point or another, and we must certainly all reflect on the words that we use. I can guarantee that there will be no shilly-shallying. The law will be obeyed, and I look forward to discussing that in more detail when I'm visiting the Scottish Parliament next Thursday, this place permitting.
Sir Edward Lee.
The difficulty we face is that most laws are relatively easy of interpretation because they prevent you doing something rather than make you do something. They prevent you murdering your wife, they don't make you love your wife. So this Act is capable of numerous interpretations, and we are talking about a completely hypothetical situation, like what is a deal, for instance. But there's one way around this. We just need to compromise and agree a deal.
Minister.
I thank my right honourable friend for that, and his mastery of some of the technical details, I'm sure, will pay him in good stead in his candidacy for your role, Mr. Speaker, as and when that comes. He's right in saying the bill is not perfect. Specifically, the Kinnock Amendment that was passed, government believe, does have deficiencies, and its effect is unclear.
Yvette Cooper.
Can I ask the Minister what his interpretation of the law is? If there is no deal agreed by Parliament, if the Prime Minister hasn't got a deal, if Parliament hasn't voted in favour of no deal, does he think that the law then requires the Prime Minister to write a letter? Yes or no?
Minister.
The government will take legal advice on this and a number of other issues, and as she knows, there's a long-standing constitutional convention that neither the fact nor the content of the law officer's advice is disclosed outside government without their consent, and I'm not intending to break that convention today.
Greg Hands.
Delighted to hear again of the government's commitment to getting a deal, which is actually what this House ought to be debating in the coming weeks. Could you just tell us a little bit, though, more precisely, how the passage of this Act has made the negotiations and discussions in Brussels more difficult?
Minister.
I thank the honourable gentleman for that question. There was a big shift in the negotiations when the Prime Minister met with Macron and Merkel, and that has really opened up the dialogue with the Prime Minister's Sherpa travelling twice a week and then 3 times a week, meetings at the UN General Assembly and a number of other forums. That activity has slowed potentially as a result of the House of Commons position, and what the House of Commons has done is making a deal more difficult and making no deal, which is not what we want, more likely.
Tom Bray.
Mr. Speaker, if the Prime Minister fails to secure a deal by the 19th of October and refuses to send the letter, as he's required to do so by law, is his intention to resign or to stand down temporarily and let someone else in government sign the letter for him?
Minister.
The Prime Minister will obey the law.
Justine Greening.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The problem with the answers from the Minister is that he's obviously needing to leave the government significant wiggle room, because clearly the honourable member for Stone has reflected the underlying government policy, which is it wants to find a way to avoid complying with the EU Withdrawal Act No. 2 that this House has passed. I think this does this country a real disservice, because it means it will take us till late October before we actually resolve an answer to that question that the government is clearly raising. Wouldn't it be better for people in Britain if they were simply transparent about their views and intentions, and we could find a way to resolve them much earlier?
Minister.
If I can try to be clearer, the government wants to be transparent. We want a deal. We'll use every bit of wiggle room we can find to get that deal.
Mr. Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The House is grateful to the Minister for confirming that the government will obey the law, but it should not need saying. And the fact that the Minister is here today having to answer these questions is a sign of the anxiety felt on both sides of the House and by many people in the country about the way in which the government is conducting this matter. The problem we have is that the answer, the very clear answer that the Minister has given, is not compatible with the answer that the Prime Minister gave yesterday evening to my honourable friend, and I just want to read from column 821, the exchange. If he does not get a deal or no deal through this House by the 19th of October, and those are the 2 conditions that would mean he wouldn't have to write the letter, my honourable friend went on, will he seek an extension to the 31st of January from the European Union? The Prime Minister, no. How on earth can what the Minister has said in good faith, and I have great respect for him, possibly be reconciled with what the Prime Minister said to the House of Commons last week?
Minister.
Well, I was here when the Prime Minister made that statement. He came, the honourable gentleman from the SNP said, why is he not here today? The Prime Minister was here for 3¼ hours, asking, I think, over 125 questions. Forgive me, Mr. Speaker. 111. Thank you for rescuing me, Mr. Speaker. I know your encyclopedic memory would be better than ours. The Prime Minister really doesn't want an extension. Every sinew of government is focused on a deal. The honourable members say that is not the case. My day is being filled with trying to find a deal. That is the right thing for the country. It's the right thing for Parliament. And it's the right thing to do. And we will obey the law at every single point.
Anne Milton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And if I may associate myself with remarks that you made at the beginning of these proceedings. My honourable friend's insistence that the government will comply with the law and his repetition of that sounds like he's dodging something, is the problem. And I am a simple soul, so I would like to ask my honourable friend, under what circumstances will the Prime Minister seek an extension?
Minister.
Well, a week is a long time in politics, and in the negotiation, things move relatively simple. The Honourable Lady says answer the question. We've tried to be as simple as we can, distilling it down to as few words as possible. We will obey the law, but who knows what will happen between now and then in the negotiations. We are seeking a deal, and the nature of that deal is moving forward on a daily basis. So beyond saying we will always abide by the law, I'm not going to get into it any further.
Angela Eagle.
Speaker, but notwithstanding the Minister's answer today, in answer to a question from me, the Prime Minister hinted that he would obey the law. He said directly to my honourable friend last night that he wouldn't, and the Minister's answers today would be listened to with a little bit more belief if senior sources in number 10 didn't keep briefing that they were going to break the law.
That's right.
Minister.
Well, the Honourable Lady has a minister, not a senior source in number 10. She has someone on the record, a minister, saying we will obey the law. I think that trumps any, so say, off-the-record briefing.
Mr. Simon Hall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Tomorrow the Prime Minister will hold a political cabinet. Could I ask my honourable friend the Minister to make sure that it is heard that we support the Prime Minister in his pursuit of a deal, and certainly have a huge reluctance to an extension. But it comes to a very bad place in politics when a Tory government's adherence to the rule of law comes under question and is in doubt. There needs to be a change in the mood music emanating from number 10, because we are as a Tory party, we obey the rule of law, and the fact that that is a question in this place should bring shame on all of us.
Minister.
I'm sure a number of people will hear his comments. I will also pass those comments to the Secretary of State, who will attend the Cabinet on behalf of the Department exiting the European Union, and I thank him for those comments.
Joanna Cherry.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister has this morning repeatedly said that he will obey the law, but it's the law of the land that if the Prime Minister can't get a deal or no deal through this House by the 19th of October, he must seek an extension to 31st January from the European Union. Last night, as the Right Honourable Member for Leeds Central said, the Prime Minister was asked by my honourable friend, the Member for Edinburgh South, so for the 6th and final time, if he doesn't get a deal or no deal through this House by 19th October, will he seek an extension to 31st January from the European Union? And the Prime Minister replied no. So again, I asked the Minister to explain how his assurance this morning that the law will be obeyed sits with the Prime Minister's direct denial last night that the law will be obeyed.
Minister.
The Prime Minister doesn't want an extension. He will obey the law, but every sinew of our efforts is based on getting a deal. And if this House got behind a deal, perhaps we could move forward and change the tone of this place that collectively we are unhappy with.
Maria Caulfield.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Part of the EU Withdrawal No. 2 Act is also to agree a deal by October the 19th. But you would not get the impression, with the obsession of an extension being discussed in this place, would the Minister agree that if people want to avoid a no-deal exit, that all our energies should be behind getting a deal and getting it through this place? Or is the real motive about stopping Brexit completely?
Minister.
I fear the Honourable Lady is right in that many that are less worried about the law are more worried about stopping Brexit. We've had extension after extension, and the answer to this uncertainty cannot be more extension.
Chris Leslie.
Isn't the most visible evidence giving us grounds to doubt the government's intention their £100 million billboard advertising campaign saying, get ready, 31st of October, here we come, which is actually inaccurate and misleading, because at nowhere, not even in the small print, does it mention that the law of the land may prevent a no-deal Brexit. Shouldn't the government be honest with businesses and consumers? And isn't it time, because I certainly will be, writing to the Advertising Standards Authority, that the government should be honest in its advertising and not mislead the public in that way?
Minister.
Well, let's be honest, no deal is a very real possibility. Even if this House extends, whether that's through this bill or some other mechanism, it still might be in the same position at the end, and a deal might not be done, and we would be in a no-deal position. It is right that every responsible business prepares for no deal, despite the fact that we'll want a deal.
Chris Green.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Extension or a renegotiated deal are the two options, but from the debate we've heard today, an extension is all that's being demanded. As the European Union does actually now show it's prepared to renegotiate, should this House of Commons get behind the Prime Minister, send him with the United House of Commons to get the best deal for the United Kingdom? If not, this House is seeking to defeat democracy and the democratic decision of the British people.
Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for that question. Mr. Speaker, it does worry me that this House seems to consistently agree on what it doesn't want, but fails to grasp what it does want. If we could take some of this energy around semantics of obeying the law and put it into actually getting a deal done, I think this Parliament will be held in greater respect than it currently is by the country.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister knows that he's a popular man in the House, and we all know there are people across the House that are more popular and less popular. Indeed, we had a junior minister already went out just now shouting, and I deplore that, and I want all of us to work together harmoniously. But could he just answer this? He said just now he wants greater transparency. There is a rumour running around the place, and it's in the press, that the government is again going to shut down Parliament for its own purposes. Is that right? And why are they doing it?
Minister.
Well, it's the first I've heard unpopular, but I thank the honourable member for Huddersfield for that. I think he may very well be misinformed. But when it comes to rumours, I'm slightly conflicted in that I'm not sure whether I have more pleasure here at the dispatch box answering questions from the opposition or being at Conservative Party conference speaking to lobbyists.
Ben Bradshaw.
People watching this, Mr. Speaker, will notice that the Minister has been at the dispatch box for nearly 40 minutes and has repeatedly failed to answer the simple question, which I'll put to him again. In the absence of this House supporting a deal or no deal, how will the government comply with the Benn Act and leave the European Union on the 31st of October?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, for 40 minutes I've tried to give a consistent answer. I think it's the case that honourable members don't like that answer.
No. Angela Smith.
Everyone understands that the government is trying to get a deal. We know that. We don't need to hear it again. But this House bears a responsibility to test the government's intentions in the event that on the 19th of October, this House fails to agree either a deal or no deal. So once again, I press the Minister, please do the House the respect of giving a proper answer to the question. How do you reconcile refusing to ask for an extension with obeying the law, the European Union Withdrawal Act No. 2? How do you reconcile those two things?
We don't want an extension, but we will obey the law as it stands at that time.
Seema Malhotra.
The Minister has repeatedly answered questions with what the government wants to do. But in circumstances in relation to the law, what's important is not necessarily what we want to do, but what we might be obligated to do. So could I ask the Minister a slightly different question? What is the Minister's understanding of what the government is being asked to do under the Benn Act in the circumstance that by October the 19th there is neither a deal agreed by this House and nor has no deal been passed?
Our focus is on a deal. When it comes to the point that she's referring to, we will look at the law very carefully and we will obey the law.
Yeah. Lisa Nandy.
Us in this House who genuinely want a deal and have been working cross-party to try and achieve it. And in fact, we amended this legislation to make it clear that the purpose of this extension would be to achieve and agree a deal. But can I just say to the Minister that we can see what is happening here. We can see what the Prime Minister was doing with that horrendous, divisive language yesterday. We can see that this is a clear electoral strategy to whip up hate and try to divide us and to whip up the hate of people against Parliament. And let me say to him that for those of us who do want to work cross-party to achieve a deal, this is making it much, much more difficult. So will he restore some trust now to this House of Commons and tell us clearly on the record that if a deal is not achieved by the 19th of October, the Prime Minister will sign that letter seeking an extension with the European Union?
I want to restore trust in the House. There is genuine division. It's not just an issue of linguistics and language. The House is divided, the country is divided, which is why we want to provide as much clarity as possible that we want a deal, and if we don't get that deal, we will obey the law as it stands at the time.
Clive Betts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I come back to the Minister. So if this House doesn't agree a deal and doesn't agree no deal by the 19th, is the government saying that they believe then there is a doubt that the law does require the Prime Minister to sign the letter asking for an extension?
Very good. I'm not going into that legal advice. I've not done that. I think the Honourable Gentleman's asking me if that is the point that I'm making. That was not the point that I was making. And in an early answer to an Honourable Lady, I talked of legal advice and the normal conventions around legal advice.
Mrs. Madeleine Moon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Tuesday, I was in Addis Ababa. I was with a delegation from across the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. We were meeting with the United Nations, with the European Union, and with the African Union. I sat with my colleagues and saw the shock on their faces as they saw a pronouncement that a British government was deemed to have acted unlawfully. In an alliance, trust is essential. It used to be that when you talk to the British, we could say, "My word is my bond." They now no longer have that trust. Is the Minister aware, and I understand his expertise, particularly in relation to Africa, of the damage that is being done internationally to our reputation when we hear of a government trying to wriggle their way out of a binding legislative decision by this House of Commons? There is an international danger to our reputation. I saw, as my NATO colleagues watched on their iPad, because they all speak English, the responses from across the British press. They watch this House daily. They no longer have the level of respect and regard for this House that used to be felt. Can I urge the government to rebuild that respect, because its dangers and its risks to this country are huge?
Minister.
I thank the Honourable Lady for that question, and also thank her for the work that she does on defence. She gives me an opportunity to confirm this government's belief in the international rule of law, and specifically, and incredibly importantly, in relation to NATO. As whilst exiting the European Union, quite rightly, is something that's taking up an awful lot of time in this House, the relationship across the eastern border and the importance of NATO is more important potentially than it ever has been for a long period of time, and it's important that our NATO allies, whether they be in meetings or Addis or in normal NATO meetings, should know that they can rely upon the United Kingdom as they have done previously.
George House.
The Minister earlier appropriated the words of Harold Wilson when he said a week's a long time in politics. So what does he think is going to happen in the next week, or for that matter the next month, that will change the terms of the then Act?
Oh yes, yeah. Thank you for reminding me whose words I was stealing to try to sound eloquent. I think anybody in this House that predicted where we might be in a week would be a fool. And if anyone does have any certainty, I would suggest they head to the bookie shop.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It just feels like we've entered into some kind of surreal world, a parallel universe, a bit like Alice in Wonderland, where words mean whatever we want them to mean, where he's outdoing the Queen, you know, who was having the Queen in Alice in Wonderland, who was thinking 6 impossible things before breakfast. If anybody watching this will just think that this government has lost leave of its senses, it cannot be trying to claim 2 incompatible things are compatible. So I ask him again, will he stop hiding behind the falsehood that legal advice is necessary to clarify the law on this, and tell us how the Prime Minister is going to keep to the law?
Well, I must say, Mr. Speaker, I didn't quite keep up with all the Alice in Wonderland references, but I'm more than happy to discuss this over a cup of tea, as long as we're not considered 2 mad hatters.
2 what?
Mad hatters.
Vernon Coker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I ask the Minister, who I think many of us feel has prevaricated with his answers today, can I just ask the Minister again and try what my honourable friend, my right honourable friend from the front bench was asking him? In terms of complying with the law, the Prime Minister is required to send a letter should a deal or a no deal not be agreed by Parliament. The schedule to the bill actually has the letter. That is part of the law. And it starts with, "Dear Mr. President," and it finishes with "Yours sincerely, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom." How on earth can the Minister stand there and say he can comply with the law without reassuring Parliament that in the circumstances that the 2 conditions laid out in the Act are not met, that he can't say at that dispatch box that in those circumstances the Prime Minister would sign the letter which is attached in the schedule to the bill?
Yeah. I've consistently said the Prime Minister will obey the law, but we don't want to get to that position. We want to get to a deal position as early as possible, and that is what we are trying to do. That's what we are mandated to do by the referendum, by the British people, and that's what previous laws have instructed us to do.
Sammy Wilson.
Speaker, the Prime Minister hit the nail on the head last night when he described this bill the way he did, because the fact of the matter is he has got 2 choices: go in all sincerity and negotiate a deal which we know will be voted down by those who don't want us to leave the clutches of the EU, or to crawl to Brussels begging to be allowed to stay at the cost of £1 billion a month. Would the Minister not agree with me that if there is such distrust in the Prime Minister, the courageous thing to do would be to allow a general election, allow the people of UK to decide what they think of this humiliating piece of legislation, and if it wasn't for the fact that the scary cats on this side of the House are running away from the electorate, they would do that today?
Minister.
I thank the right honourable gentleman for that intervention. And I do think, I should say thank you for what's now appears to be a cross-party consensus that we should have a general election. It's good to see other people, even other honourable friends on the other side of the House, also saying that they would support an election. And a general election will lance the boil that has been festering here in this Commons. We are a divided House, and we are divided not just on normal party lines, but we are crucially dividing ourselves against the nation. And that is only going to be resolved by either delivering Brexit or by going back to the nation and saying, what do you want?
Luciana Berger.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister this morning has repeatedly told us that his government is focused on a deal. If that is the case, why yesterday did the Prime Minister call for an immediate confidence vote, which would shut down Parliament within 14 days and make voting on a deal impossible?
Minister.
Well, Parliament would be able to vote, the new Parliament would be able to vote on a deal, and negotiations would continue. Ministers remain ministers as we go through the process, and negotiations would continue.
Debbie Abrahams.
I welcome the change in tone from last night, which many people have already said was absolutely appalling. But I have to say I don't find it helpful to question the legitimacy of the EU Withdrawal Act number 2. Can I ask the Minister, is this the basis for the apparent contradictions between what he has said and what he said to my honourable friend, the member for Edinburgh West, last night? Or is there something else?
Minister.
Well, let's be clear. I didn't question the legitimacy of the EU Withdrawal Act. My honourable friend, a member for Stone, questioned it, and I did say there were a number of outcomes within that bill, but I didn't question and had no intention of questioning the legitimacy of a bill that has been passed through the House. We opposed that bill. We lost.
And so we're
Patrick Grady.
Exactly, Mr. Speaker, because that was the House exercising the sovereignty and taking back the control that the Leavers were so desperate to do. And I don't know what message he thinks it sends, even to Leave voters, when there are questions about whether the government will respect a law that this House has passed. The one thing the House does agree on, the one majority that there is that we do not want to crash out with no deal. So if they really want to get around the Benn Act, the way to do it is actually to agree an extension now, and then we can all have the general election before that extension period ends.
Yeah. Minister.
Well, all I'll say to that, Mr. Speaker, is it's somewhat amusing to see a member of the SNP defending the sovereignty of this House. Thank you.
Kate Green.
Mr. Speaker, I accept what the Minister says, that the Prime Minister wants to secure a deal. But may I respectfully suggest that the best way for us to do that with our European friends and allies is in a relationship of mutual regard and respect. To talk of the legislation as being a surrender act implies that they are somehow trying to bully us into accepting a deal that will be good for them but bad for us. May I invite the Minister to pass back to the Prime Minister that that language is not only unacceptable in creating divisions in this country, but it also divides us further from our European neighbours.
Without wanting to up the tone of a debate that's been quite consensual, what the Act does, it does surrender some of our negotiating power by matter of fact. It compels the government to do something, reducing the leverage in negotiation. I'm actually seeing that as being part of department negotiating. It is deeply unhelpful, and it has surrendered some of our powers of negotiation, which make it more likely that we'll get no deal. It's unfortunate. I'm not trying to raise the tone in any way, but just speak factually about what is happening.
Jonathan Edwards.
Mr. Speaker. Am I right in understanding that the British Government has sought and obtained legal advice on how to avoid the provisions of the Benn Bill?
We don't discuss what legal advice has been taken, nor do we discuss the contents of that legal advice, as I've already said in the House.
Martin Whitfield.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I take this opportunity to welcome the Minister to the dispatch box. We've had a lot of discussion today and intimation about complying with the rule of law. The Section 3 of the Act will oblige the Prime Minister to do something. In the spirit of the law, how will the Prime Minister meet that obligation? Minister.
The law very clearly lays out the obligations in Section 3 and other sections. I have nothing further to add.
Gavin Newlands.
Mr. Speaker, if, as many of us suspect, that the Prime Minister and Mr Cummings will attempt to navigate a path around the effect of the Ben Act, a feeling that the Minister's answers this morning have not assuaged, what will the Government's response be when the Court of Session in Edinburgh uses its noble vacuum powers to sign the letter seeking extension for him?
Well, I don't think that I'm sharing secrets. It is the Government's intention to navigate its way around the Ben Act by getting a withdrawal agreement and a deal through this House of Commons. That's our plan A.
Lady Herman.
Very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. I have to tell the Minister I'm extremely concerned that he has indicated that it is acceptable to the Government and to the Prime Minister, for whom he's speaking this morning, that a no deal will be acceptable. Can I just remind the Minister of the very serious consequences of a no deal for Northern Ireland? And I shouldn't need to remind the Minister or indeed the Government. The consequences will be, if there is any hardening of the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, it will incentivise dissident Republicans who are already attacking the PSNI, the Police Service of Northern Ireland. It will incentivise them to even greater violence along the border. And with that, there will be a backlash, I suspect, certainly a reaction from loyalists. I don't predict that with any pleasure at all, but I think that this Government should be aware of the consequences of a no deal in Northern Ireland. It will also embolden. It will embolden. Thank you. It will embolden Sinn Féin to campaign for a border poll in order to take Northern Ireland out of the United Kingdom into United Ireland. The Government needs to be extremely mindful, and for the Minister to imply that it is acceptable that we leave without a deal is absolutely, totally unacceptable.
Minister.
We want to leave with a deal, but no deal is a possibility. I'm very, very aware of the concerns that she raised, and the Government committed to the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. And in fact, one of the first things I did as a minister was went to Belfast and also went down to visit the border and people that lived around that border. You know, in itself, turning up and looking around doesn't solve the problems, but I am actually very aware and consistently bear these things in mind when looking at negotiations, particularly around the negotiations that are currently happening in relation to the Northern Ireland border, and that will continue to be very important in the Government's machinations.
Dr. Sarah Wollaston.
Mr. Speaker, the terms of the Ben Act are very clear, but so too is its intended purpose and spirit. The Minister hasn't been asked today whether the Government and the Prime Minister wanted to comply with the terms of the Act. He's been asked a very specific question as to whether, if by the 19th of October this House hasn't agreed to a deal or a no deal, will he write the letter as set out in the Ben Act asking for an extension? Can he answer yes or no? Because I'm afraid we're just having no clarity at all on that very specific question today.
We will obey the law.
Andrew Slaughter.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister's knowingly confusing the Government's negotiating position with the authority of the law as made in Parliament and enforced by the courts. The Prime Minister says without evidence the Supreme Court is wrong, and now he is saying he won't follow a very clear provision in an Act of Parliament. Does the Minister accept that that trivialises and undermines the rule of law?
No, it is not the Government that is causing the confusion. It is the Act itself and the constitutional position we found ourselves in for a number of areas, including the Fixed Term Parliament Act, which means that we can't have a general election and resolve this by going back to the people that have already decided in a referendum. Predecessors of this House fully supported.
Alan Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, to any rational person, the law of the land states that if a government doesn't get a deal through the House of Commons or gets a mandate for no deal, then the government must write a letter on the 19th of October asking for extension. Now, we know the Prime Minister says he won't do it, and the Minister at the Stats box won't answer yes or no about sending a letter. He just keeps saying obey the letter of the law, and sometimes adds at that time. So without giving away the convention on the contents of legal advice, will he confirm, yes or no, that the government is taking legal advice that they think there could be alternatives to not sending that letter and complying with the law?
Successive governments not only don't comment on the detail of advice, but also on the issue of whether legal advice has been taken. So the answer to his question is no, I can't comment on that further.
Justin Matters.
Mr. Speaker, businesses are telling me that thousands of jobs in my constituency are at risk if there is no deal. But it sounds to me like the government think that is a price worth paying to get Brexit done by the 31st of October. Is that right?
We've got the highest rate of employment since decades. I myself am specifically responsible for small and medium-sized enterprises in deal and no deal. And what I would say is, well, some of the larger businesses are well prepared. There's still more room for further preparations of smaller businesses, and would recommend they contact through the government website, which is absolutely superb and very detailed. Last week I was in Birmingham, and whilst there were some specific issues raised that we're working on, they were impressed with the government's preparations.
Wayne David.
A few moments ago, the Minister said that the Ben Act was unclear. Could he explain to the House why he thinks it's unclear?
Good question.
That's a fair question, but as I've already, it's a fair question, but I'm not necessarily going to give him an answer that he's happy with. I've already said that the government will take legal advice, but that legal advice will be confidential, and that cannot be shared and would not be shared with the House, and that would have been the case when he was an MEP or when he was a minister.
Stuart C. MacDonald.
Some countries' governments try to make compliance with the law considerably easier for themselves by making political appointments to the judiciary. Can he please categorically rule out reports that the government is seriously considering political appointments to the judicial bench?
I think that's well beyond my pay grade.
I say for the benefit of those observing our proceedings as much as for members of the House, there is a notable, though on the whole I think healthy competition between two honourable members who share the same surname, but whose first name, though Stuart in each case, is spelt in one instance EW and in another instance UA. One is Stuart C. MacDonald, the other is Stuart Malcolm MacDonald. I've called Stuart C. I don't want the honourable gentleman to feel socially excluded in any way. That would be very damaging. I don't want that to happen. Stuart Malcolm MacDonald.
I'm very grateful for that, Mr. Speaker. Like the Minister, we are both successors of the late Teddy Taylor. And when Teddy was a Glasgow MP, he was known as the tenement Tory who talked straight. So let me invite him to find his inner Teddy this morning. Are there circumstances in which the Prime Minister will write to Brussels as outlined in the Ben Act?
Minister.
I thank the honourable gentleman enormously for allowing me to pay tribute to my successor. It was great predecessor. Apologies. It was great disappointment whilst he saw the referendum vote, and I campaigned with him on the referendum vote, and he was in good health at that point, that he's now passed away. Even when we passed that vote, and we knew he was in ill health, but we thought that we would have Brexit by that point. I think, looking down on us, he will be disappointed collectively that the House haven't continued in that light and delivered on the Brexit result.
Ruth George.
Thank you. Minister, this House and the country would have more confidence in the government's both will and ability to do a deal within the rapidly reducing timeframe if we had any evidence of that happening. The Prime Minister's update yesterday contained a lot of criticism of this side of the House, but not a single word on what the actual progress he had made in negotiations in the last few months. Will the government bring a statement to this House of their progress and the abundant options that the Prime Minister has claimed there are?
Minister.
Well, the Prime Minister answered a large number of questions. There was plenty of opportunity when he spoke for over 3¼ hours. I suspect there will be plenty of opportunity to go into more detail on the negotiating strategy over the coming days and weeks.
Clive Efford.
Speaker, the Minister has pointed over this side, suggesting that people who want to remain are going to vote against a deal and will never vote for one. But there are members on his side of the House who would never vote for a deal as well. They've thrown 21 Tory MPs out of their group, some of which have said they would vote for a deal. So can I ask, has the Prime Minister had negotiations with the European Reform Group, some of which are in the Cabinet, and have they signed up to say that they would vote for a deal that he negotiates?
Minister. The Prime Minister constantly meets and talks to all members of the Conservative Party and other parties.
Sweeney.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister said there would be ample time after an election for any new government to legislate accordingly and to have a vote on a deal or seek an extension. But actually, normally it would take at least 4 weeks for any new government to pass any substantive legislation. So that not just simply reveal that having an election before seeking an extension is simply a bogus device for this government to engineer a no-deal Brexit by default?
No, not at all, but the Honourable Gentleman is right. It is a highly constrained timetable, but after 3½ years we only have ourselves to blame collectively as a House.
Richard Bacon.
Mr. Speaker, nearly every question from the other side has used the word if. Does the Minister not feel it's unreasonable to expect him to have a crystal ball and to be able to predict what the situation is that this country will face on the 19th of October? And what complying with the law on the 19th of October will require? And isn't it better that we just accept his assurance that the government will obey the law?
Mr. Speaker, I thank the Honourable Gentleman for that question. A lot could change between now and the 19th, and actually I think providing the clarity that we will obey the law is actually clearer than picking specific laws and saying how we will obey them.
Alex Abel.
Notwithstanding Minister's last response, he himself said that the plan A is to get a withdrawal agreement agreed with the European Council. That is merely 3 weeks away, and he also said they're only just at the stage to reopen the withdrawal agreement. If no agreement is reached at the European Council, does he guarantee that this House will have a motion on no deal and give us the opportunity to vote on whether we accept no deal or not?
Well, it's not that negotiations have just restarted. Michel Barnier's mandate to negotiate hasn't formally started, and that can't actually happened formally until the European Council, where effectively all the work will be done. But right from the point of the meeting with Macron and Merkel, there was a step change in meetings, both at Sherpa level, at political level and technical level with the Commission. That was the point that I was trying to make, not that negotiations had only started recently.
Neil Gray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At the start of this urgent question, the Minister quite rightly reiterated your call for greater respect. But one way of being respectful in this House is to be transparent. And quite clearly the Minister has not been transparent in repeated questions about whether or not the Prime Minister will write the letter seeking an extension. So I give the Minister one final opportunity now to be clear and unequivocal in his response, not just hiding behind some form of words about obeying the law and dodging the question, but will he confirm now, if the first two conditions of the Benn Act are not satisfied, will the Prime Minister write the letter seeking that extension, yes or no?
Minister.
I hate to disappoint the honourable gentleman, but we will obey the law.
Thank you. Order. Urgent question. Catherine West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To ask the Foreign Secretary for an update to the House on protests in Hong Kong.
Thank you. The Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs, Secretary Dominic Raab.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the honourable member for Hornsey and Wood Green for her urgent question? And can I also just say that I think on all sides of the House, this is an example where we can come together and discuss an issue which is of joint concern across the political spectrum. I remain seriously concerned by the situation in Hong Kong. Protests are now in their 16th week. Millions have exercised their right to peaceful protest. The majority are doing so peacefully and lawfully. However, I know the House will join me in condemning violence that we have seen on the streets of Hong Kong from a minority of those engaged in those protests. It is essential that protests are conducted peacefully and within the law, and that the response of the authorities are proportionate. With that in mind, the United Kingdom supports the one country, two systems model and framework, and of course the rights, freedoms and the high degree of autonomy granted to Hong Kong and its people under the Chinese-British Joint Declaration. That joint declaration was signed by the government of the People's Republic of China and Her Majesty's government in 1984, and the autonomy, the rights and the freedoms it guarantees enshrined in the Hong Kong Basic Law. It remains as valid today as it was when it was signed almost 35 years ago. It is a legally binding international treaty, and we expect China to live up to its obligations under that treaty, and indeed as a permanent member of the UN Security Council under its wider international human rights law obligations and indeed the UN Charter. The UK government believes that a resolution can only be achieved with meaningful political dialogue, which builds trust with all the parties on all sides. And I welcome Carrie Lam's formal withdrawal of the extradition bill on the 4th of September, and indeed some of the incremental steps that she has taken to improve the credibility of the Police Complaints Council. The initiative this week from the Hong Kong government to consult with the people it serves will be a first step on the essential path towards a more inclusive political dialogue, one which builds trust with all communities in Hong Kong. In recent weeks, Mr. Speaker, I've spoken to both the Hong Kong Chief Executive Carrie Lam and to the Chinese Foreign Minister, State Councillor Wang Yi. I've made clear that the UK continues to support one country, two systems. But I've also made clear our concern about human rights, and in particular, the mistreatment of those exercising the right to lawful and peaceful protest. And the concerns of those peaceful protesters should be addressed by political dialogue, not crushed by force. I've also spoken to a wide range of my counterparts internationally, and I welcome the strong statements from our international partners. The Prime Minister raised Hong Kong at the recent G7 meeting, where all G7 partners reaffirmed the importance of the joint declaration and called for an end to violence. We will continue to engage with Hong Kong and the Chinese government, reiterating the fundamental importance of upholding the UK-Chinese joint declaration. Hong Kong's high degree of autonomy is what guarantees its future prosperity and success. It is incumbent on all sides to respect it.
From West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Throughout the summer, Hong Kong has continued to be gripped by protests, with tens of thousands of demonstrators filling the streets each weekend to demand their fundamental rights. Although the Chief Executive of Hong Kong, Carrie Lam, has announced that the controversial bill, the extradition bill, will finally be withdrawn, this, for some, is far too little too late. The level of protest has grown in the face of brutal police repression, and I've been appalled by the way that protesters have been beaten by police officers and gangs rumoured to be associated with the Hong Kong government. Basic democratic freedoms of the press, of the right to assemble and the right to protest are enshrined in the Sino-British Joint Declaration, an internationally recognised treaty to which we are, of course, the signatory. In the past few weeks, protesters have also been gathering outside the British consulate in Hong Kong, demanding that our government do more. Would the Foreign Secretary please tell the House what contact he has had with the Hong Kong government about the ongoing protests in Hong Kong, and specifically on the issue of police brutality? What dialogue he has had with the Hong Kong government to promote a move towards universal suffrage as per the Joint Declaration? What steps the government is taking to support any holders of a British National Overseas Passport, or BNO, in Hong Kong who are facing undue arrest or harassment as a result of taking part in the protests? And finally, when is the next 6-monthly report on the Joint Declaration going to be published?
Foreign Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, can I thank the Honourable Lady for her questions and her interventions on the substance, and also the very constructive way with which she's presented them to the House. Can I also be clear at the outset that I share her concerns about the repression of peaceful protests, mindful, as I've already said, that some of the protests have been violent, and that is unacceptable too. And I also share her concerns to make sure that the right of peaceful protest enshrined in the Joint Declaration is respected on all sides, in Hong Kong and as between us and the Chinese government. I would make a couple of further points, if I may, Mr. Speaker. I think the Joint Declaration as a bilateral treaty reflects not just the right of peaceful protest, but it's also reflecting basic international human rights obligations which would apply to China in any event. It is a bilateral expression of those rights, and it's important for not just the people of Hong Kong, but for the wider model that China advocates and which we wish to respect, which is the one country, two systems model. The Honourable Lady asked what contact I'd had with the Chief Executive, Carrie Lam. I spoke to her on the 9th of August at length, and I raised all the issues that I've already expressed, but in particular the disproportionate use of force by the police against the protesters. I also raised the issue of the Police Complaints Council. In line and alongside the withdrawal of the extradition bill, that is something where the government in Hong Kong has taken some steps to try and strengthen and reinforce its impartiality and therefore its credibility. I think we need to test that very carefully and see whether actually it produced an impartial and objective review. On the issue of BNOs, which she rightly raises, and can I thank her for that, of course, the status of BNOs is part of the package that was agreed in terms of the Joint Declaration. There is no right of permanent residence for UK under the BNO passport, but it is part of the overarching model of one country, two systems, which, at least at this point, we are arguing needs to be respected, but it needs to be respected on all sides, including by China. Finally, on the 6-monthly report, I would hope that to be due at the end of October or November at the latest.
Tom Tugendhat.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I welcome my right honourable friend for coming to the chamber today, and my right honourable friend and fellow member of the committee, the honourable member for Hornsey and Wood Green, for raising this important question. Though I appreciate the points that the Secretary of State has already made about BNOs, it is clear that the UK government did take a subtly different position at the time of handover, when certain key members of the administration were granted UK citizenship in order to give them the confidence to stay on at a moment of, let's face it, trouble and doubt. Would there not be an opportunity now to give people the assurance that they don't have to make urgent decisions now by knowing that their rights will be guaranteed? And could he also perhaps talk to his friend, the Lord Chancellor, about the presence of UK judges in the Court of Final Appeal? Because, of course, we all know that Hong Kong's economy is underwritten by the rule of law, as indeed is ours. And the independence of the judiciary and the ability to have judges who can speak freely and fairly and without threat of influence from Beijing is one of the things that underwrites not just Hong Kong, but also China's economic expansion. So valuing those judges, knowing that they are an integral part of the rule of law, and not just on commercial rights but on civil rights, would seem a very good place for the UK to start.
Can I thank the honourable member, the chair of the Select Committee? He makes a number of very important, powerful points, and I've been reflecting on them and indeed the reports from his committee. Can I just say I will of course pass on his comments in relation to the judiciary to the Secretary of State for Justice. And he makes those points in an important way. And of course they're good for Hong Kong and its reputation and the wider reputation of China as a place that is open to do business. On the issue of B&Os, and I just want to be clear in relation to this, of course the B&O status, which didn't entitle the holders of those passports to right of permanent residence in the UK, was part of the delicate balance in the negotiations that were conducted and then concluded at the time of the joint declaration. We are seeking not to change the status of any one part of that package, but rather to press all sides, including the Chinese, to respect the delicate balance reflected in that package. And that is why, for the moment, we will not change or alter the status of the B&Os, but also make sure that in terms of the rights and the entitlements that they are entitled to expect within that status, of course, they'll have our full support.
Helen Goodman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, for granting this urgent question. I'd like to congratulate my honourable friend, the member for Hornsey and Wood Green, on securing it. As the Foreign Secretary said, we're now entering the 16th week of this chaos, and there is absolutely no sign of the crisis abating. We continue to witness appalling brutality by the Hong Kong police against the protesters. The abandonment of peaceful methods by some sections of the pro-democracy movement does nothing to help their cause, which we on this side of the House believe is right and just. I wonder if the Foreign Secretary could tell us, has the Hong Kong executive made any progress in setting up the independent inquiry which we have all called for? Secondly, I'd like to ask him whether the Foreign Office got any credible explanation from the Chinese government for the paramilitary forces which were massed on the Hong Kong border over the summer. The announcement that the Hong Kong executive will be formally withdrawing the extradition bill is welcome, but it is too little too late. Peace and normality will only be achieved if the Hong Kong government meets the largely reasonable demands of the protesters and fulfills promises made to Hong Kongers in the Basic Law. This needs to start with democratic reform and moves towards universal suffrage. The Foreign Secretary is the 5th Minister in 4 months to have spoken on the UK's moral and legal responsibility to safeguard the rights of Hong Kong citizens. I'd like to ask him 2 further questions. What are the implications for B&O passport holders of the government's announcement of changes to the rights of students studying in the UK, which we had over the summer? And secondly, what is he going to do to fulfil the UK's obligations to Hong Kong under the joint declaration if the situation does not improve?
Well, can I thank the Honourable Lady for the very measured and careful way that she has responded to this issue. Amidst all of the other Brexit divisions we've got, it's actually rather important that we have some cross-party consensus where it's practicable on this issue, because it allows us to send the clearest signal to our international partners and indeed to Hong Kong and to China in relation to the importance of these issues. So I welcome that. I share her concerns around the issue of peaceful protest. We've expressed those to the Chinese government. I spoke to the Foreign Minister about this. I've also spoken to Carrie Lam. I also think she's right to say that we condemn violence and that risks tainting the protests, which on the whole and by the majority have been conducted in a peaceful way. She asked me about the independent inquiry. So the administration in Hong Kong has not gone the full way that we would like to see them go, but they have taken steps to reform and reinforce the independence of the Police Complaints Council. Whether that's enough, we shall see. What we need to make sure ultimately is that we have the goal of a proper, thorough and objective review of some of the conduct that we saw by the police against those protesters. I share her concern around reports of troops being increased at the border. I think we, both in this House but also across the international community, must be very clear with our Chinese friends and partners about the Rubicon that would be crossed if we saw a major intervention in Hong Kong. And no one wants to see any repeat of what we saw in terms of the tragic circumstances in Tiananmen Square all those years ago. We want China and Hong Kong to move forward, not backwards. She made the point that the extradition bill is not enough, and I share her frustration to see more done in relation to political dialogue. I think, in fairness, it is important to note that there is steps that are taking place this week and indeed today to engage local groups with political dialogue. And as she has said, it is the long-standing view of the UK that there is a transition to universal suffrage for both the elections of the Chief Executive and the Legislative Council, because of course that's provided for in the Hong Kong Basic Law, and that would be the best way to guarantee the stability of Hong Kong, but also to respect one country, two systems, which is advocated by China. There's been no change in the status of BNOs, but I overall would like to share her concerns. There isn't a silver bullet answer to this. We know that the Chinese government will be very mindful of the behaviour and its reputation and what's going on in Hong Kong in the lead up to the anniversary on the 1st of October. What we need to make sure, both in this House but across the international community, is we're seized of this issue, that we're making it very clear to the government of China that we want to respect one country, two systems, but that also needs to be reflected on their side.
Fiona Bruce.
Freedom of speech, including on constitutional matters, is one of the rights enshrined in the Joint Declaration. Absolutely. And yet recently we've seen pressure being exerted on individuals to desist from dialogue on certain issues. Pressure which is completely unacceptable in any country, let alone in Hong Kong, where these rights were enshrined in the Joint Declaration. What can our government do publicly to ensure that the right to free speech is upheld in Hong Kong?
Thank the Honourable Lady and pay tribute to her tenacious efforts to raise the issue of free speech and peaceful protest right around the world. She's a credit to this House, but also all the work she's doing for the party on this. The UK has not just raised the issue of peaceful protest and the right of free speech, mindful that it must be lawful and peacefully conducted. I've done that consistently and will continue to do so, and I know the Prime Minister feels the same way. And as she says, and as I think the Shadow Minister said, we need to see steps towards meaningful political dialogue. We have seen the removal of the extradition bill, and we have now seen the initiative from Hong Kong to consult with the people from across the communities in Hong Kong. That is a first step. But I think we should also recognise and credit the administration in Hong Kong when it takes steps in the right direction. What we now need to see is that followed up with meaningful, inclusive dialogue which can preserve the autonomy of Hong Kong and the one country, two systems approach that China advocates.
Stuart Malcolm MacDonald.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I welcome much of what the Secretary has had to say this morning. And of course, it's important that we recognise the courageous strength of those in Hong Kong who have protested over the past few months. Indeed, this all takes place on the 30th anniversary of the Baltic Way, and what an inspiration it is to see that spirit of the Baltic Way being invoked, standing up for liberty and freedom as they rightly should. The Secretary mentions the legally binding agreement with China, and whilst it's not for me to defend old empires, he is of course right to say that it is still to this day a legally binding agreement, and of course that must be upheld, not least because international treaties are being picked away at by populists around the world. But Mr. Speaker, context is everything, and the UN Security Council that he mentions, as we know from the conflict in Syria for example, is utterly broken. And this can't be resolved in a broken Security Council. So I've been asking the government for years now what proposals it has to see reform of the United Nations Security Council, which will be pivotal in this affair and in much else. And just finally to ask, this issue in Hong Kong is undoubtedly falling prey to international disinformation and misinformation campaigns from China to Russia and many others. What steps is the government taking to support those in Hong Kong to get the truth out to the world?
Well, can I thank the honourable gentleman for his remarks and for his support in the approach that we're taking. He made some, I think, valuable points about the joint declaration. It's legally binding, and of course there is always the need to be vigilant to make sure that international treaties are respected on all sides. It's also not just a bilateral arrangement. It reflects wider international human rights obligations, particularly those reflected in the ICCPR on peaceful protest. I don't think that the situation in Hong Kong is analogous particularly to Syria, but I do share his, I know, but he made the reference, but I do share his sense that we need to make the UN work as effectively as possible. We've been out in the UN General Assembly this week. It's been curtailed, as he will know, but these are the kinds of things that we talk about. And of course, China is a permanent member of the UN Security Council, so I think it is reasonable and legitimate to expect China to be upholding the values of the United Nations when it comes to Hong Kong.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Following directly the point just made by the SNP spokesman, is there any evidence that the Chinese intelligence services, adopting classic communist methodology, are trying to discredit the protesters by infiltrating them with agents provocateurs where the violent fringe is concerned? And will he give special consideration to about 265 former Hong Kong Armed Services members who should in the past have been offered the choice of a British passport, but I believe have yet to receive that offer?
Thank him for his remarks, and I know he follows these issues very carefully. I'm going to be a bit careful about commenting on what is really happening in relation to intelligence services from any other country, but one thing I would say is it's becoming increasingly clear that in relation to some of the counter-protests that there are criminal gangs involved, and it's not clear entirely what their links may or may not be with the various administrations. I think for our part we need to play this in a very straight way, which is to say there are some legally binding obligations on the Hong Kong government and indeed on China to respect peaceful protests. Frankly, wherever those incursions or erosions or impingements come, we will call them out.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In response to a written question tabled by my right honourable friend, the member for Orkney and Shetland, ministers have confirmed that UK law enforcement agencies provide training to the Hong Kong police. With that in mind, can I ask the Foreign Secretary, has this training been put through the Overseas Security and Justice Assistance Risk Management System? And if so, what assessment, particularly in light of recent events, has been made of the risk that this training may now be assisting in human rights violations in Hong Kong?
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman. Of course, one of the reasons that we might take a judgment in relation to Hong Kong or in anywhere in the world to provide police training is precisely to make sure that it is done in a proportionate way and with some restraint where that's called for. So I wouldn't quite accept the premise that he's argued from. It's true. It's true also, well, we will constantly consider all assessments in relation to this kind of support. He will know that, as the former Foreign Secretary stated during his remarks in the House of Commons on the 25th of June in relation to, for example, crowd control equipment, that no further export licences will be granted for that kind of equipment unless we've got absolutely clear assurances that our concerns around human rights and fundamental freedoms are respected and addressed.
Oh, such illustrious colleagues. It's very hard to choose. Well, Sir Geoffrey Clifton Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I ask my honourable friend if he might consider raising an issue with Carrie Lam when he next has a conversation with her, and it's this, which has been raised with me by a number of young people, including the demonstrators, that the social mobility in Hong Kong for the ordinary person is very difficult, even if they've got a good degree, to actually get a job that's well enough paid to better their standard of living from that of their parents.
Thank my honourable friend. He raises a very important point, which is that the protests we're seeing have been fuelled by the economic, social concerns that in any mature democracy would find expression through the democratic institutions. And I think what he's highlighting in a very specific way is why the value of having political dialogue leading to the democratic autonomy that's reflected in the basic law will be important, not just for the individuals raising those issues, but for Hong Kong as an autonomous entity within the one country, two systems model, to be able to address them in a way which is constructive and in the long-term interests of the people of Hong Kong.
Chris Law.
Mr. Speaker. All UK citizens' rights and means to travel subject to entry requirements should continue to be protected, and we in these benches call on the Government of China and Hong Kong to facilitate the safe passage of UK citizens when they are compliant with the law. BNO UK passport holders in Hong Kong, however, are not currently recognised by China. But can the Foreign Secretary update the House as to the consular services and support that has been offered to these UK passport holders?
Can I thank the Honourable Member for that? I mean, we do provide consular assistance to B&O passport holders, but he's right also to talk about the limitations on that status. That was part of the careful balance that I referred to in the remarks I made earlier. What we want to see is on all sides that's respected. That's part of one element, which is part of the one country, two systems model. That's what China advocates. That's what we want respected, but it must be respected on all sides.
A noted sinologist, I think. Mr. Richard Graham.
The 98th anniversary of the Communist Party of China approaches imminently, and there are a range of issues which the Foreign Secretary knows are delicately balanced. One, of course, is the importance of what happens in Taiwan. The second is what is going on in Xinjiang. And the third is the current crisis in Hong Kong. The Foreign Secretary knows that committees in both the Senate and Congress have advanced a new Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, which would require an annual assessment to see if Hong Kong is sufficiently autonomous still to justify that city's special trading status with the US. Can my right honourable friend tell the House whether he's discussed this with his US counterparts and whether things are at a stage where Hong Kong's special trading status could be seriously endangered from the situation?
Can I thank him for his remarks? He's raised quite a few questions. Let me just try and address two of them. First of all, in relation to the US legislation, I was in Washington earlier this week, and I had a chance to talk to Congress men on both sides of the aisle about this, and they are making progress in that regard. He also referred to the anniversary of that's coming up on the 1st of October, and some of the wider concerns beyond Hong Kong, and he mentioned Xinjiang. We are concerned, as one illustration of the reports, and they're credible reports, of over 1 million people being held in camps against their will. I think there is increasing international concern about that, and about the repressive mistreatment of those people and the impact that has on their international human rights obligations. Again, we make the point, China is now a leading member of the international community. It's a P5 member of the Security Council. Very important that those basic international obligations are respected.
Jenny Chapman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's a long-standing affinity between many in my constituency and Hong Kong, primarily through family links or because they were posted there during service in the army. There's a particular concern about British national overseas passport holders and the rights that are afforded to them. The Minister has been very clear that he doesn't wish to look at that at the moment because it forms part of the agreement, and there's a logic to that. But would he be prepared to move quickly should there be some variance, shall we say, from that agreement in some other regard, and that their rights may need to be re-examined very, very speedily?
Careful way and measured way that she's answered that question. Our overarching effort now is in relation to conveying the message from the UK but also the international community that the one country, two systems model is respected. That has implications for BNOs, it has implications for autonomy and the right of peaceful protest on Hong Kong. They're all part of the same package. I'm not going to start getting into what will happen if that package is ripped up on the other side, but I do think, particularly given the concerns that the Shadow Minister raised about the question of troop movements and whether or not there might be a major intervention from Beijing, we need to be very clear that that would put at risk the model that China itself has advocated.
Bob Seeley.
Does the Foreign Secretary understand the concerns in this House over the B&Os? China is not trying to abolish the one country, two systems, but it is squeezing it and it is pressuring it. And therefore, it is right for us to look at alternatives to the current B&O status. So giving B&Os the right to work in the UK at short notice and potentially a fast track to residency. And on that point, there are also 250 former servicemen in Hong Kong who arguably we have not looked after well enough. And will the Foreign Secretary and this government look at those too? Thank you.
The honourable gentleman. He's right, I think, to say that China is so far respecting the one country, two systems model, and for the large parties trying to respect or seeking to respect, or at least talking about respecting the degree to which it's reflected in the joint declaration. I think as long as we're in that position, then it would be wrong for us to unpick one element of the package, which is the status of B&O nationals. Of course, as the Honourable Lady has mentioned, if it's all reviewed on the side of China, then we would obviously want to think again. But I think for the moment, the right thing to do is to convey to the Chinese government and the administration in Hong Kong why it's in all sides' interests to respect the one country, two systems model.
Louise Haig.
Ofcom is currently investigating the Chinese state-backed news channel CGTN for its coverage of the Hong Kong protests. I wonder whether the Foreign Secretary has spoken to his DCMS colleagues about that investigation, and particularly about the future of the channel ahead of its launch in London, if it's going to continue to propagate state bias in direct contravention of our broadcasting regulation.
I thank the Honourable Lady. She makes an excellent point, a very powerful way. She'll understand if I respect the role and the remit of Ofcom in this regard, but of course we follow that very closely.
Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Hong Kong is clearly a major financial centre and trading centre. So will my right honourable friend impress upon the Chinese government and the opportunities that arise from having such a vibrant centre, and that anything that prejudices or brings that into question actually damages China as well as damages millions of citizens around the world?
My honourable friend makes an excellent point, which is, of course, that it's in the interests of Hong Kong and indeed China to respect the one country, two systems model and the autonomy, both economic and political, that's reflected within it.
Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As has already been mentioned, the 70th anniversary of the Communist Party is coming up next week, and it's been reported that this could be accompanied by large-scale pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong. We've seen the aerial photographs of armoured vehicles lined up, ready to respond. Can I ask, has the UK government been in touch with its counterparts in China to stress the importance of maintaining a proportionate response and the importance of the rule of law and the protection of human rights throughout what could be a difficult period?
Honourable Lady, and I agree with much of what she said and indeed her concerns, and I can reassure her that I met with Foreign Minister Wang Yi in Bangkok on the 31st of July, and I would have been due to meet him in New York this week, but of course the House is back sitting.
Luke Graham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I welcome some of the comments from my right honourable friend, especially condemning violence but praising peaceful protest. Can I ask him how he can use his offices and our position in the UN to make clear that the Sino-British Declaration is a live international treaty and not a historical document, as many Chinese officials have tried to allude to?
Well, thank the honourable gentleman. He's absolutely right, and I think it is widely accepted that this was an international agreement. It is binding under international law, and whilst there may be some who call that into question, I don't think it's in the interests of anyone in Hong Kong, in China, and for our part, the United Kingdom, to call that into question. And that is something with which I think there is widespread agreement amongst our international partners.
Dr. David Drew.
Mr. Speaker, those of us with friends in Hong Kong know how difficult it is now for people to go about their ordinary lives. Their businesses are being affected. Doesn't it behove the responsibility of the whole international community now to try and settle these disputes before it gets even worse?
Yes.
Bill Grant.
very much, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree that the latest developments we witness in Hong Kong are part of a wider trend of civil and political freedoms being reduced over time? And what actions can the UK take to halt or indeed reverse such a trend?
Well, we can make our position clear both to the administration in Hong Kong. We make our position clear to my Chinese opposite number. The Prime Minister and all members of the government do. We also need to work with our international partners to look very carefully at this situation and make sure that we're sending and telegraphing as clear and as broad a signal to the administration in Beijing, the government in Beijing, about our concerns that he rightly raises.
Paul Sweeney.
The comments my honourable friend, the member for Auckland South Perthshire, made about the situation, the Chinese side repudiating the joint declaration. Would the Foreign Secretary consider making it clear to the Chinese side that there's disquiet in this House about the status of BNO nationals, and if they continue to repudiate that agreement, that international treaty, this House would consider revisions to the 1985 Hong Kong Act and extend full citizenship to BNO nationals as a potential measure?
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman. I don't think that the point right now is to issue threats to the government of China. What we do need to do is be very clear, both as the UK but with our international partners, that we want to respect the one country, two systems, and that some of the things that we're seeing both in Hong Kong but also some of the concerns that have been expressed on all sides of the House about the military build-up of troops on the Chinese side of the border would put that at risk.
Sir Philip Dunn.
Not actually, sir. But thank you. Thank you for elevating me, Mr. Speaker.
Well, I apologise to the right honourable gentleman who's a member of the Privy Council. I had thought that he had that additional honour, but I mean, I think it's only a matter of time, and if I've moved it on a bit, well, then that is surely a positive thing. For now, Mr. Philip Dunn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I say to my right honourable friend that I lived in Hong Kong for a period of years, including over the political transition, so I feel particularly acutely the pressures on the people in legitimately protesting there, and I welcome the concerns across the House about the way that's being handled by the Hong Kong authorities. Although it was over 20 years ago, I'm acutely aware of the very strong and close trading and financial links between this country and Hong Kong. And can I ask my right honourable friend, what can he do to ensure that business confidence is maintained, to ensure that Hong Kong remains the vibrant financial centre which is so important in international trade?
Well, can I thank my right honourable friend? He's absolutely right about this. Of course, the first and foremost responsibility for respecting the stability and the economic vibrancy of Hong Kong is with the Hong Kong administration and, of course, more generally with the government in China. But what we wish to do and will seek to do, both at the level of business, civil society and in our conduct and dealings with both the Hong Kong administration and the Chinese government, is to be very clear on where we think their interests lie and the risks of undermining the autonomy and its economic autonomy as well as political autonomy, which touches on the issues that he raises.
Vera Hobhouse.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There have been widespread reports that crowd control equipment is being used against protesters that violates their human rights. In his answer that he gave earlier to my right honourable friend and the member of Streatham, he said that export licences would not be granted in respect of crowd control equipment from the UK to Hong Kong unless assurances are given that human rights will not be violated. Is he therefore saying he has asked for those assurances and they have indeed been given?
What I'm saying is we have a system for export licence control which is rigorous and robust, one of the best in the world, and we will keep it constantly under review. And yes, that does mean we monitor and listen to what the officials on the other side are saying in relation to importing those goods, but fundamentally we take an objective and independent assessment to make sure the UK rules are respected.
Steve Dowell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was going to ask the Foreign Secretary about the position with BNO passport holders, but he's already answered many questions on that, but just want to put my support that we do all we can for BNO passport holders. But can I also ask him what assessment he has made
of the treatment of religious minorities in Hong Kong by the Chinese authorities? And will he ensure that this government does everything it can not only to support the civil and political freedoms of the people of Hong Kong, but also religious liberty there?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. And I have also, just to say, and put on the record, had conversations, and I know the Home Secretary is very appraised of the situation of BO nationals, so it is something that we have discussed and keep under review. He rightly raises the issue of freedom of religion, and I think there's a broader issue around freedom of belief and conscience. We're concerned about the persecution of religious groups in China on the grounds of religion or belief. We're concerned that the Chinese government guidelines restricting unapproved religious activity, education and travel would restrict the peaceful observation of those rights, which are of course guaranteed under international human rights instruments.
Stephen Kerr.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And building on the response that the Foreign Secretary has just made to my honourable friend, the confidence of the people of Hong Kong is undermined in the intentions of the Chinese government by the clear evidence of the violation of human rights, especially in the area of freedom of religion or belief, or the exercise of conscience, as he described it. Can the Foreign Secretary be specific about what representations Her Majesty's government have made to the Chinese government about the 1 million Muslims that are being held in re-education camps?
Thank my honourable friend. We raised this in the United Nations. I've been very clear on the UK's position, which is we are very concerned about that. The reports look credible and they look like they violate the most basic undertakings under international human rights law, and we'll continue to make sure that those concerns are expressed very directly and candidly. We want a friendship and a partnership with the government of China. I've said that to the Chinese Foreign Minister, but with all good friendships you must be able to talk candidly where you have concerns.
Thank you. Order. Urgent question. Chris Law.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To ask the Secretary of State for International Trade if she'll make an urgent statement on the recent unlawful award of armed export licences to Saudi Arabia in contravention of a Court of Appeal ruling that determined that the UK must cease arms exports to the country.
Mr. Speaker, today I will be laying a written ministerial statement updating Parliament on the latest situation in relation to the undertaking given to the Court of Appeal on the 20th of June about export licences to Saudi Arabia and its coalition partners. As the government informed the court on the 16th of September and followed up with an affidavit today, my department identified errors that had taken place in the export licensing procedure in relation to the Saudi coalition's activities in the conflict in Yemen. As I stated publicly on the 16th of September, I unreservedly apologise for the export licences that my department issued in error. I have also given my unreserved apologies to the court. A procedure to ensure that export licences were not granted for goods for Saudi Arabia and its coalition partners for possible use in the conflict in Yemen was put in place on the 20th of June 2019. This followed the court order and the then Secretaries of State's statement to Parliament. The Export Control Joint Unit subsequently issued export licences to Saudi Arabia and its coalition partners, and in line with the agreed procedure, these were signed off at official rather than ministerial level. It subsequently came to light that 2 licences were in breach of the court undertaking, and 1 licence was granted contrary to the statement in Parliament, as these licences were for goods that could possibly be used in the conflict in Yemen. Without seeking to prejudice the independent investigation, it appears that information pertaining to the conflict had not been fully shared across government. As soon as the issue was brought to my attention on the 12th of September, I took immediate action, taking immediate steps to inform the court and Parliament, putting in place immediate interim procedures to make sure the errors could not happen again, instigating a complete and full internal review of all licences granted for Saudi Arabia and its coalition partners since the 20th of June, and the DIT Permanent Secretary commissioning on my behalf a full internal investigation. Court and Parliament were informed on the 16th of September with the appropriate detail. And the interim procedures mean that senior officials in DIT, FCO and MOD guarantee the latest information available to government is used in their advice. All recommendations to grant licences for the export of items for Saudi Arabia and its coalition partners will now be referred to ministers rather than being signed off at official level. The full review of licences for Saudi Arabia and its coalition partners is currently being undertaken, and this internal review is still ongoing. As a result of the internal review so far, we have identified one further licence that has been granted in breach of the undertaking given to the Court of Appeal. This licence has not been used and has now been revoked. My officials are also carrying out an urgent review of the composition of the coalition. This has identified a further licence which is in breach of the parliamentary statement. We have reassessed the licence in light of the latest information and subsequently revoked it insofar as it applies to Jordan. My officials are continuing to review all the information relating to licences granted to Saudi Arabia and its coalition partners since the 20th of June 2019, and we will be open and transparent with the Court and Parliament as to any new issues that emerge. In addition, the DIT Permanent Secretary has commissioned on my behalf a full independent investigation. This will establish the precise circumstances in which these licences were granted, establish whether any other licences have been granted in breach of the undertaking to the Court or contrary to the parliamentary statement, and confirm that procedures are in place so that no further breaches of the undertaking can occur. This investigation will be led by an independent senior official, the Director General of Policy Group for the Department of Work and Pensions. It is possible that more cases will come to light. As I have done so far, I will keep the Court and Parliament informed as to any new information that emerges.
Chris Law. Mr. Law.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the response given by the Secretary of State and the shocking revelation that 2 further extra licences would be breaking the law and that further may yet to be discovered. But I welcome, however, her unreserved apologies for the errors, as it has been called so far. The situation in Yemen is currently the biggest humanitarian crisis in the world, with half the country's population at risk of famine and 22 million Yemenis in need of aid and protection. While the UK has given £770 million in aid to Yemen over the past 5 years, it has earned 8 times more from arms sales to Saudi Arabia and its coalition partners. This is not the result of a so-called inadvertent error, but of a shamefully incoherent foreign policy that has put profit ahead of upholding international humanitarian law. The UK has licensed £4.6 billion worth of arms to Saudi military, a military that's been found directly accountable by the UN for an estimated 10,852 civilian casualties as of November last year. And now, despite the Court of Appeal ruling that UK arms sales to Saudi Arabia were unlawful, the Secretary of State has approved arms export licences to the Royal Saudi Land Forces. The Secretary of State has said that, and I quote, "The fact that RSLF troops were deployed in Yemen at the same time the licence was issued, this licence should not have been granted." How could this ever have been in any doubt that the RSLF were in Yemen, given that they make up over half of the Saudi armed forces, and the Saudi armed forces have invaded Yemen by land? It's crystal clear. The process which led to these licences being granted demonstrates the same carelessness and utter lack of regard for human life that's defined the UK's arms sales to Saudi over these years. Rather than wasting time and money appealing the court decision or lobbying other foreign governments to resume weapons sales to Saudi Arabia, will the Secretary of State now rescind these unlawfully granted arms export licences? Furthermore, does she take full responsibility for the Department's unlawful award of arms export licences in contravention of the Court of Appeal, and therefore will she do the right thing and resign?
Clearly, the conflict in Yemen is a very concerning situation, and we fully support the UN-led process to reach peaceful resolution. And as the honourable member mentioned, we contribute £770 million of UK aid. But what we are talking about today is specific procedural issues in terms of the issuance of export licences. We have a procedure that follows the consolidated criteria that is very clear around humanitarian law. And in their judgment on the 20th of June, the Court of Appeal is very clear that we have in place a rigorous and robust process. The issue is how that process has been followed. And this is why, when I was first informed of this issue on the 12th of September, as Secretary of State, I took immediate action to have an internal investigation into what had happened, to ask the Permanent Secretary to get another leader from another government department to fully investigate the process, and to make sure no such licences could be issued in error by putting in place a robust process. At the same time, I took immediate steps to inform Court and Parliament. I've been completely open and transparent about what has happened. But the issue here is a procedural issue, and I don't want to prejudge the investigation, but the issue appears to be the sharing of information across government, which is why senior officials will now be asked to sign off on the advice that is put forward, and ministers will be asked to sign off these export licences.
Order. It might be helpful to colleagues if I indicate that, whilst wishing to accommodate the legitimate and not inconsiderable interest in this urgent question, I want also to move on to the next urgent question at or close to midday. Therefore, there is a premium upon brevity from back and front benches alike. Mr. Philip Dunn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could I say to my right honourable friend that I think everyone across this House shares the views that she's expressed about the significance and the horror of the humanitarian situation in Yemen. I think what she is expressing to the House today is quite proper remorse to ensure that the government follows the procedures for arms exports that are well established in this country. But could I ask her to reflect on the fact that only yesterday we were debating in this House the impact on the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia from their neighbours across the Gulf, the Iranian attack on oil facilities in that country. This is a very sensitive area. One of our key allies in the Gulf is under considerable pressure from the Iranian authorities, and as a government we need to act responsibly to ensure that we stand by our allies when they come under attack.
Well, my honourable friend makes an important point. The topic, however, of today's question is about the following of the procedures in the consolidated criteria. The consolidated criteria are right. That is a good way of looking at making sure that we are issuing export licences to the right parties. The problem here is specifically whether that process was followed correctly within government and whether information was shared between government departments. That is the issue we have identified. I've taken immediate steps to make sure that information is properly shared when those decisions are taken, as well as investigating what went wrong with those processes being followed. But of course, I take full responsibility as Secretary of State, and I have made an unreserved apology both to Court and to Parliament.
Order. Enviable eloquence to be equalled by breathtaking brevity. Mr. Barry Gardner.
Indeed, Mr. Speaker. They did know. The government did know. They just didn't tell the Secretary of State's department.
Yeah.
Which department knew? Which minister had the responsibility to tell the Secretary of State? And why are they not sitting alongside her making an apology to Parliament?
Yes.
The evidence presented during the court proceedings earlier this year and the recent revelation proves that the government has failed to abide by its own undertaking. On 2 occasions since the Court of Appeal's verdict, licences have been awarded in contravention of the determination precisely because a careful assessment had not been carried out. I'd ask the Minister to confirm the extent to which the reports that were made in 2015, the widespread reports that Saudi troops had been deployed on the ground and were leading the coordinated efforts of coalition forces in Yemeni territory, why were those reports not properly investigated and assessed by her department? I note her letter to the Committee on Arms Export Control that the inference is that no such investigation had ever been carried out. Now, her predecessor advised that there were a number of ways that they monitor potential breaches, one of which was the ground military and diplomatic staff through our positive close relations with the Saudi Arabian officials. The Saudi Arabian officials must have known that their own troops were on the ground. So why did this fail to communicate in the close positive relations that our staff had with them? I welcome the fact that the Secretary of State has launched a full inquiry, but it won't have escaped her notice that just a short while ago the arms export fair took place in London. £6.3 billion of arms exports have been exported to the coalition by this government, 5.3 to Saudi Arabia. What further deals were done there? And given that she said it is possible that more illegal deals may have taken place, does she actually think that instead of it being possible, that is highly probable?
Well, the honourable gentleman asked me first of all about the process that took place within government. The answer is the joint unit is staffed by officials from the Ministry of Defence, the Foreign Office and the Department of International Trade. And there clearly was a failing in terms of sharing information across government. We are conducting an investigation which is being conducted by a Director General at the Department of Work and Pensions, looking precisely at the question of which department issued the information or did not issue the information, how was that shared? And that will be put forward in due course. It's very important. This is a complex area. The Export Controls Unit approve approximately 16,000 licences per year. So it is important that we get this right and we don't rush to an answer before we are ready to do so. In terms of the consolidated criteria on licensing, it's also important, of course, that we adhere to the terms of our undertaking to the court and our statement to Parliament. And what I was talking about earlier was specifically breaches of our undertaking to court and of our statement to Parliament.
Sir George Hollingberry.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. This is clearly a matter of serious moment, and I welcome the tone that the Secretary of State has taken today, and indeed her admission that things have not gone right. Can she assure me of two things? First, that there is a full and complete investigation going on, and I think she's talked to that already, but particularly that the aim of this investigation will not just be to find out how this happened, but to ensure that it cannot happen again.
Well, I can assure my honourable friend that, first of all, I have put in place an interim procedure to make sure there is sign-off from senior officials within all three relevant departments and ministerial sign-off as well on any proposed export licences to the relevant parties. And secondly, that we are conducting this investigation, which will be led by a Director General from the Department of Work and Pensions, into exactly what went wrong in this case to make sure it cannot happen again.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I recognise the Secretary of State's apology and welcome it, and her acceptance of responsibility, which I also welcome. I'd also say it's true that the breaches in the export licences which form this urgent question may well be described, as she said, as procedural. But this case highlights some profound problems with her department. Spare parts for armoured vehicles used by Saudi land forces, spare parts for military radio used by Saudi land forces, which form half of the Saudi military, which were operating on the ground in Yemen when the licences were issued, which form part of the invasion by land into the Yemen from a country, Saudi Arabia, found to be in breach of international humanitarian law, which is precisely what is supposed to be checked before licences are granted. So can the Secretary of State tell us, was the provision of incomplete information shared across government a simple incompetence? Was her department and others not aware of their responsibilities in this regard? And can I say, she'll have to be convincing, because I'm not convinced the actions being taken so far remove the perception that this government and this department are prepared to ignore the law, in this case from the Court of Appeal, when it suits them to do so.
The Court of Appeal were very clear in their judgment that there is a rigorous and robust process in place across government. The question is about the specific sharing of information between government departments. I have absolute confidence that the unit, when they receive information, implement that in doing their work. The issue is the sharing of information. And this is why we have conducted an internal review into the licences already issued, as well as asking another government department to look across the board at where information was shared. But this is not an issue about the process, which was deemed by the Court of Appeal to be rigorous and robust. This is about how that process has been followed. And there are a lot of people saying, well, why can't we do this quicker? It is very important we get this right. And in the interim period, I have put in place a procedure that makes sure there is senior sign-off from all three departments, the Foreign Office, the Ministry of Defence and DIT, as well as ministerial sign-off. And there wasn't ministerial sign-off on these licences. This was under the previous procedure. There will now be ministerial sign-off on all those relevant licences.
Can I appeal to colleagues, please, to ask single-sentence questions and for brief replies, because that way we'll get through as many as we possibly can in a truncated period of time. Luke Graham.
Mr. Speaker, I welcome my right honourable friend's statement. It's important when we get things wrong, we own up to it and take responsibility. Can my right honourable friend please assure this House that no further licences will be granted to Saudi Arabia or its coalition partners for weapons that could be used in the Yemen, especially when many are Scottish made?
Well, I agree with my honourable friend that it is important that we are clear when errors have been made, and I am clear that is the case. I'm confident we now have a robust interim procedure whilst this investigation is conducted, and we make sure we have a proper procedure in the long term to ensure the process is followed.
First, I'm going to call the longest-serving member of the Arms Export Committee of the House, Anne Clwyd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I would remind the Minister, the new Minister, does she realise that it took almost a year at the start of this Parliament to set up the Committee on Arms Export Control, because the government dragged its feet, and I would say they dragged their feet deliberately. And can she answer the question? I'm sick of hearing about rigorous and robust. It's neither rigorous nor robust. Representatives of the various parties in the Saudi-led coalition were recently at the arms fair. Can she give us an assurance that no new undertakings or contracts were agreed to service or export new goods to those countries involved in the coalition in the Yemen?
Well, the role of the joint unit is to scrutinise licences. And what I can assure the Honourable Lady is that we have put in place an interim process to make sure that all available government information is reflected in advice to ministers on the issuance of those licences to Saudi Arabia and its coalition partners, and that will specifically have ministerial sign-off.
Neil Parish.
Mr. Speaker, I also very much welcome the Secretary of State's statement. Britain plays a leading role in both diplomatic and humanitarian aid in Yemen. What more political pressure can we bring to bring about a political solution, does she believe, in the Yemen?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right that we play a significant role in terms of aid to Yemen. We have provided £770 million worth. And I think it is important that we work through the UN, which the Foreign Secretary is committed to seek as quickly as possible an end to conflict in Yemen.
Mr. Speaker, when court orders are maybe contravened a couple of times, that can be perhaps dismissed as a failure to follow procedures. But when it happens on multiple occasions, it suggests there is a systemic problem. The system isn't working. And therefore, will the Minister look at implementing a policy of the presumption of denial in respect of all export licences to countries listed as human rights priorities on the annual Foreign Office Human Rights Report, so that those exports to those countries would be banned in the first instance?
Just to be clear for the honourable gentleman, on the 12th of September, that's when the errors were identified within the department and notified to me. We then notified the court and immediately conducted an internal review of all the licences already issued. So all of these issues relate to decisions that have been made before the 12th of September. And that's why we've put in place the new interim procedure.
Stephen Kerr.
A robust export licensing regime in the world. To that end, what is the basis upon which these licences are granted, as in this instance?
Well, the basis on which these licences are granted is in line with the consolidated criteria, and specifically for Saudi Arabia and the coalition partners, we are very much cognizant of the Court of Appeal's ruling and also the undertaking of the former Secretary of State to Parliament.
Ellie Reid.
Mr. Speaker, despite repeated assurances from the government over the years that they'd acted within the law concerning export licences for arms to Saudi Arabia, last week we found out the government had acted unlawfully, and today that there might be further breaches. When will this government recognise the plight facing the Yemeni people and immediately suspend all existing and future arms exports to Saudi Arabia?
Well, I acknowledged in my statement earlier that there have been errors in the way this procedure has been followed, which is why we've put in place interim measures to deal with this and are conducting an internal review as well as an investigation by another government department.
Keith Vaz.
The Minister's apology is welcome, but the narrative is shameful. In August of this year, 236 Yemenis were killed and the bombing raids reached 20,000. And last week, a bomb fell on a mosque and a bomb fell on a family eating their dinner. What do they put on the death certificate? Do they put death caused by administrative error?
Well, as I said earlier, I unreservedly apologise for the errors that were made, and that is why on the 12th of September, when this was brought to my attention as Secretary of State, I took immediate action to stop this happening.
Mr. Stephen Twigg.
The Court of Appeal identified a failure by the government to meet its legal obligation to make a systematic assessment of past possible violations of international law. The Secretary of State today has acknowledged a failure to share information across government. Surely these failures demonstrate that we no longer have a robust system of arms control in this country.
I don't agree with the honourable gentleman. We have found specific errors for which I have apologised and taken immediate action to address. But overall, as the Court of Appeal themselves point out, we have a robust and rigorous process.
Graham Jones, Mr. Speaker.
Graham Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I make a declaration first? I've just returned from a 2-day visit to Abqaiq in Saudi Arabia, facilitated by the Kingdom, and in the coming days I will include that in my register of members' interests. I'd like to thank, as Chair of the Committee on Arms Exports, I'd like to thank the Secretary of State for writing to me immediately on this issue and making it very transparent what the problems were, so I'm grateful to her for writing to me. My question is simply this: we have a Kingdom of Saudi Arabia who are fighting vile terrorists in Yemen who are using human shields, and we are approaching the point, would she agree, where our current arms regulations, export regulations, are not suffice to deal with the issue that the rebels, the terrorists, are using human shields, and the number of civilian casualties is as a result of that?
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his comments. I mean, in this particular case, we have already identified there is a problem in terms of sharing internal information within government that led to these export licences being issued. Of course, we're doing further investigation work looking at that, but that is specifically what the issue around the breach of the Court of Appeal judgment is, and that is where I'm putting my focus as Secretary of State.
John Woodcock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I refer members to my declaration in the Register of Members' Interest? Now, these mistakes are highly regrettable and point to the need to the government to put its house in order in terms of the overall suspension as quickly as possible. But is it not lamentable for any member of this House to imply that the suffering in Yemen is principally caused by any arms relationship or by our coalition partners, rather than the disgrace of the Houthi Islamist regime?
Immensely obliged to the honourable gentleman. Secretary of State.
Well, the honourable gentleman makes a effective point. However, the specific issue I deal with as Secretary of State for International Trade is making sure that our export licensing regime is in line with the process we've laid out, as well as the judgment of the Court of Appeal.
And I'd like to accommodate remaining colleagues, but can I just say that Colleagues who ask long questions do so knowing that they're stopping other colleagues contributing. Now, I'm sure they're not going to do that because they're comrades and they'll behave in an egalitarian manner. I feel absolutely certain of that, starting, of course, with Lloyd Russell Moyle.
Last year, the department issued 30 million rounds of Warsaw Pact weapons to Saudi Arabia incorrectly, then the Court of Appeal judgment, and now this. Is it not time for the joint unit to be turned into an independent unit, like any other regulator, and for the Arms Export Committee to be turned into a proper committee in this House?
Secretary of State.
As I've said, there were errors made, and that is why we have asked the Director General at the Department of Work and Pensions to conduct a full review of how this process is being operated.
Louise Hay.
Speaker, are there any sanctions available to the companies involved in these mistakes, presumably some of whom know full well that they shouldn't be applying for the licences in the first place?
You stay.
The issue is over the issuance of licences. That is the issue I look at as Secretary of State and make sure it's in place properly.
Sir Vincent Cable.
Can the Secretary of State describe the action of British officials in Saudi Arabia in terms of overseeing the use of British weapons by the Saudi forces on a process agreed with her department and the Ministry of Defence?
This specific issue around our process is looking at how it was administered within government. And the specific cause of these errors, as we've identified so far, has been the lack of information sharing. But of course, I will take up the honourable gentleman's point too.
Tulip Sadiq.
Due to report back.
You stay.
I hope to have the results of the internal review that we're doing within the next few weeks.
Was there a change to UK policy on arms sales to Saudi Arabia in 2016? That is to discontinue consideration of past Saudi humanitarian law breaches.
As I've said, the issue here is not the policy so much as how the procedure was or wasn't followed.
Mr. Andrew Slaughter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the light of the continuing breaches of international humanitarian law by the Saudis, and this being another breach, another disregard of the law by this government, will she withdraw her appeal?
Well, the issue in question is specifically around whether or not the process was followed. And we have today submitted an affidavit to the court with full details.
Martin Doherty-Hughes.
In regards to the kindness of the House, may I be the first to thank the member for Dundee West, my honourable friend, for bringing this question to the floor today to expose the utter incompetence in relation to this issue. There are still thousands of UK citizens, military and civilian, working across projects which are designed to be beyond the reach of this Parliament. Therefore, can the Secretary of State give what steps the government has taken to make sure that they are not involved in projects within Yemen?
Well, this question today specifically refers to the process of issuing export licences, and that's what I've been focusing on.
Brendan O'Hara.
The case Secretary of State that this is simply a government that will always seek to break its own rules. It will always seek to turn a blind eye to breaches of humanitarian law when there is money to be made and deals to be had.
As soon as this issue was brought to my attention on the 12th of September, I have taken action to make sure it can't happen.
Alan Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The reality is these so-called errors have only been discovered after third parties have taken the UK government to court, and the government's fought this all the way through the courts. Going forward, rather than an interim procedure, is it not time just to end arms sales to Saudi Arabia altogether?
The issue in terms of the breach of the court findings is specifically around how the procedure was followed, and that is what we need to be focused on.
Thank you. Order. I referred earlier to events in the chamber yesterday. What I'm about to say, I say as much for the benefit of people observing our proceedings as for members of the House. I think it is extremely important that our proceedings are accessible to the people who are interested in them. In light of the appalling atmosphere in the chamber yesterday and the toxicity which it can spawn or exacerbate in the country at large, I have granted an urgent question to the honourable member for Birmingham Yardley, which treats of this matter. In my book, it is manifestly urgent. Urgent question, Jess Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I had wanted to ask the Prime Minister, but I shall ask the Minister if he could ask the Prime Minister to reflect on his language and his role as Prime Minister to create a safe environment both in our country and in our country's Parliament.
Thank you. Minister Kevin Foster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. British democracy has always been robust and vibrant. Healthy, respectful debate is vital to our democracy. Freedom of speech is a fundamental British liberty, but it is not an excuse to threaten or abuse anyone whose views you do not agree with. That liberty is compromised when a culture of intimidation forces people out of public life or discourages citizens from engaging in the political process. Let me make clear and say with no equivocation, such behaviour is wrong, unacceptable and must be addressed. The government recognises this is an ongoing challenge. It doesn't stop after each election. It is important we tackle this issue and ensure everyone, no matter their background, can participate in our democracy free from hatred and intimidation. That is why we are taking action to confront it. The government is committed to legislate for a new electoral offence on intimidation of candidates and campaigners in the run-up to an election. We have already made secondary legislation that removes the requirement for candidates standing at local and mayoral elections to have their home addresses published on the ballot paper, and will do the same for the Greater London Assembly elections. Members across this House have faced threats of violence, attacks on their constituency offices and staff, and abuse aimed at family members. This is abhorrent. I know honourable and right honourable members from across the House raised this concern yesterday. We want to ensure people from across this political spectrum can stand for office free from the fear of intimidation and abuse. We want to tackle this extremely serious issue and protect voters. The security arrangements for members of Parliament have been kept under constant review by the Palace of Westminster authorities and the Metropolitan Police's Parliamentary Liaison and Investigation Team. Local forces engage with their MPs and other political figures to meet their security needs. Each force has a single point of contact in place who has contact with the plate through regular updates and meetings as required. The government are also considering what further steps are necessary to ensure the safety of parliamentarians and their staff. Crucially, this applies not only to the vicinities of Parliament, but also in constituencies and online. Thus, we are working with social media companies to address threats online and abuse of MPs, candidates and others in public life to create a safe environment for debate.
Thank you. Jess Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I did ask a question, and that was if the Prime Minister would reflect, or he would be asked to reflect. I'm just going to start by saying that I am not, and nobody in here is a traitor. They're not ignoring their constituents. They are all in good faith. I was raised thinking that we were the goodies and that over there were the baddies, and what I found when I got here was that everybody pretty much, just in a different way, wants to get to the same conclusion. And I will wager that, more so than the Prime Minister, I spend time in my constituency office loving and laughing with my constituents, no matter what they voted. I don't just want to probe into the idea that we all get abuse, and no doubt we're going to hear a lot of that today, because we all get abuse, and I've had a death threat this week that literally quoted the Prime Minister and used the Prime Minister's name and words in a death threat that was delivered to my staff. So we know that it gets out. What I want to look at today, and what I want answers to today, is when there is a clear strategy to divide. The use of language yesterday and over the past few weeks, such as the surrender bill, such as invoking the war, such as talking about betrayal and treachery, it has clearly been tested and workshopped and worked up, and it is entirely designed to inflame hatred and division. I get it. It works. It is working. I mean, we're all ambitious. I'm not going to pretend that I'm not ambitious, but I also have a soul. It is not sincere. It is totally planned. It is completely and utterly a part of a strategy designed by somebody to harm and cause hatred in our country. When I hear of my friend's murder and the way that it has made me and my colleagues feel, and feel scared, described as humbug, I actually don't feel anger towards the Prime Minister. I feel pity for those of you who still have to toe his line. You, the people opposite me, know how appalling it was to describe the murder of my friend as mere humbug. Can I ask everybody to act with calm and dignity in this moment? I want to ask the Prime Minister to apologise and to tell him that the bravest, strongest thing to say is sorry. It will make him look good. It will not upset the people who want Brexit in this country if he acts for once like a statesman. Calling me names, putting words in my mouth and in the mouth of my dead friend makes me cross and angry. It makes me scared even. But I will not react. The Prime Minister wants me to react so that I join in the chaos that keeps this hatred and fear on our streets. I simply ask the Minister today to request to the Prime Minister, who's notable by his bravery today, I ask him to ask the Prime Minister to meet with me in private with his advisers and some of my colleagues and my friends from Joe's family so that we can explain our grief and try to make him understand why it is so abhorrent that he has chosen a strategy to divide rather than to lead.
Minister Foster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I will show a calm and dignity in my responses today as well. I would be very clear that the government is looking at how we create a safe environment, and not just in terms of for members of Parliament, but for journalists and for the others in public life who can face abuse merely for wanting to be involved in what they do, and of course members of the judiciary. I'm always clear no one is a traitor for saying what they believe or for arguing a different political point. That is part of public debate. The last actual traitor was in 1946, someone who tried to support those looking to overturn this democracy by violent means. But I think it is right to say that the government is moving to take action. We have the online harms white paper, working with colleagues in the Department for Culture, Media and Sport to tackle some of the corrosive nature of the debate online. We see some of the work being done across government to try and tackle where things are being done and to make sure people do feel safe to express their views, and being very clear that the law applies as much online as it does in the physical world. And I think we can all look at what may have been said over years, and I'm sure the honourable member will look at anything she said over the years about particular political figures as well. But it is about how we don't get into a game of whataboutery, but it's how we focus on what we can do to protect. And also heard the comments you made this morning, Mr. Speaker, about some of the suggestions, and I'm sure you, like me, will be interested to hear some of the thoughts that come out about that idea that has been floated with you. And of course, as the Minister whose responsibility it is for our Defending Democracy programme, I'll be only too happy to meet with the honourable member to discuss in a different format to where it comes, and ultimately to see where we can go with the approach to have. And as I say, we've already committed to legislate around intimidation election time, one of the things that many picked up last time round following the election, and see this as an ongoing debate. Plus, even actually yesterday, if this House hadn't been meeting, I was due to be having a meeting with the police to discuss what we could do to ensure all candidates received support in any future general election, as it's not just about when people are members of this place that they would face intimidation and abuse. I would say, Mr. Speaker, the government is taking a range of actions, and ultimately it is for everyone to think about what they say and also how they've contributed. And certainly today, what they'll get from the government is a calm dignity in response and making clear what we are doing to tackle this issue and create a safe environment for all, not for debate, not just members of Parliament.
Maria Miller.
When it comes to creating a safe environment in this place, we have a very clear code of conduct, which is enforced, Mr. Speaker, by you in this chamber. Yesterday, you were rightly, I think, rigorous with the Prime Minister, as ever, in the enforcement of his behaviour in accordance with that code. Now, I have the very greatest respect for my honourable friend, the member for Birmingham Yardley. We serve on the Select Committee together, and I know how passionately she feels on many issues. But I'm afraid it was yesterday she was the person I could hear screaming the loudest from her bench. So noticeable was it that she was actually having a conversation with one of the whips that was standing by the side of your chair, Mr. Speaker. It was that which created a significant impression to people watching this debate of the hostility that the media reported. Mr. Speaker, isn't one of the issues here the equal implementation of the Code of Conduct so that all members of this House feel as affected by the Code and its requirement for all of us to treat each of us with respect, regardless of party?
Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The right honourable member makes a valid point that it's for all of us to look at how we contribute to respectful debate in this chamber. Of course, in terms of what happens in this chamber, it will be yourself, Mr. Speaker, and your deputies that will ensure that members stick to the codes and practices of conduct. And of course, you have taken action when you believe that that is not occurring. But ultimately, it is about, certainly for the government, not just about this place, but about the whole of democratic debate, because there are people who will be thinking of doing their democratic duties, they see it, in standing for this place, giving their fellow citizens a chance to vote for a particular set of policies, who will want to know that in doing so, they'll have their arguments put to the test, they'll have their thoughts put to the test, their proposals put to the test. What they'll not have been put to the test is just how thick a skin they've got.
He's absolutely right, what the Minister has said. That code of conduct has to be enforced, and indeed, so far as the Chamber is concerned, adjudicated by the Chair. The record is clear, the evidence is there for all to see. People can observe week after week after week after week that there can be abuses on both sides, for example, during Prime Minister's questions, and every time, without fail, the Chair intervenes to seek to restore order. It has been the case, it is the case, it will always be the case. It isn't a matter of party politics, it is a matter of procedural propriety, and that's the way it has to continue to be. Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I start by congratulating my friend, the member for Birmingham Yardley, for securing this question. It's extremely disappointing that the Prime Minister has not respected this House by attending here today. The Prime Minister's language and demeanour yesterday was frankly nothing short of disgraceful. 3 years ago, our colleague, our member, Joe Cox, was murdered by a far-right activist shouting, "Britain first, this is for Britain." The language that politicians use matters and have real consequences. To dismiss concerns from members about the death threats they receive and to dismiss concerns that the language used by the Prime Minister is being repeated in those death threats is reprehensible. To dismiss those concerns in an abusive way, as he did, is completely unacceptable. And I pay tribute to my honourable friends for Dewsbury and for Batley and Spen and other members, including the member for Broxtowe, for what they said yesterday. Today, I've written to all members of the Parliamentary Labour Party, expressing my solidarity to my friends and set out the conduct expected of all colleagues. No side of this House, as you've said, Mr. Speaker, has a monopoly of virtue. Inappropriate language has been used by all sides. But we all have a duty to keep our debates political and not to descend into personal abuse. I disagreed profoundly with the previous Prime Minister, but she did offer cross-party talks to try to find a compromise. She also set out her approach to this House, allowing for scrutiny and debate. I was also pleased to participate in a meeting with the former Prime Minister and other party leaders about conduct and abuse in the House and around the parliamentary estate. The current Prime Minister, unfortunately, has sought to entrench divisions, refused to set out any detail of the deal he is seeking, and continues to pledge that they will leave with no deal on the 31st of October, despite the fact that this House has voted against and legislated against an outcome. Not only should the Prime Minister comply with the law, he should come to this House and apologise for his conduct yesterday, which fell well below the standards expected by the people of this country of the way their elected representatives should behave, should speak and should treat each other.
Minister Foster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I think it's clear that, having already outlined what the government is doing, but of course the Leader of the Opposition mentions the murder of Joe Cox, a dreadful crime committed by an extremist. And many of us who were in the House at that time remember exactly where we were when we heard the news of that appalling attack, in my case attending a constituency event, in the same way that many from a previous generation of politics remember where they were when they heard that our colleagues Anthony Berry or Robert Buckland or Airey Neave had been assassinated by those looking to bring terror to this country. So what I would say is that actually the biggest issue is that delay will just bring more division to this country. And in terms of having Bradford, I apologise, Robert Bradford. Thank you for correcting me, Mr. Speaker. In terms of looking to how we are tackling this as a government, we do need to bring a resolution to debates. And as the Leader of the Opposition will know, the government has been clear that we're prepared to take our arguments to the country on Tuesday, the 15th of October, and ask the electorate to pass a judgment. And that would have given a chance to not only resolve the division affecting this House, but also to give a way for the country to move forward. Because as you yourself have reflected, Mr. Speaker, the passions that this issue has inflamed will only carry on if there is not a resolution.
Anne Milton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I once again associate myself with the remarks that you made at the beginning of the proceedings today. I fear that the Minister is going to go to great lengths to take this argument to the wider issues of MP safety. But what this question is about is what happened here yesterday. It was completely unacceptable behaviour in every way. Whipping up a crowd, creating division is not helpful from whichever side it comes. If we cannot do this in this place, Mr. Speaker, maybe it is time to put aside our party parliamentary T-shirts, our Brexit Remain T-shirts, and put on a T-shirt that stands for parliamentary democracy, unity of purpose, consensus and agreement. Yesterday was unacceptable, and if we don't do something to change this, we are putting our parliamentary democracy at threat.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In terms of the question, it clearly relates to creating a safe environment both in the country and in Parliament. And certainly, as the Minister responsible, I don't want to see this about being a debate about MPs just being a case on our own. There are many who face abuse and intimidation for being part of this, from the judiciary to journalists and to those who will never be members of Parliament but who just want to take part in our democratic process. But as is touched on, we heard the comments you gave this morning, Mr. Speaker, about some of the thoughts and reflections on what may happen in this place, and ultimately it is for the House itself to decide how it wishes to regulate itself, how it wishes to behave, what changes it may wish to make to its own standing orders, and of course we can rely on yourself, Mr. Speaker, and whoever's elected to replace you to lead the way in enforcing them.
Kirsty Blackman.
Mr. Speaker, as others have said, the scenes in the House of Commons last night were deeply disturbing. The Prime Minister's tone was appalling, his behaviour was appalling, and his language was appalling. We've got in number 10 a man who has built his career on making inflammatory remarks, stoking division and shouting down those who disagree with him. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is not fit for office. His behaviour is an outrage, and his government is treating people disgracefully. People want leadership, Mr. Speaker, and they want accountability. What should have happened yesterday is that the Prime Minister should have come in front of this House and apologised for acting unlawfully. He should have held his hands up, agreed he'd acted wrongly, and pledged not to do it again. Instead, he chose to brazen it out, proving that he embodies the very worst of the wrongs in our society and totally ignoring the 7 principles of public life. Mr. Speaker, young people are watching our Parliament today. They're watching and learning that in order to get to the top, all you need to do is break the law and shout people down. The House of Commons and the Prime Minister should be setting a good example to all of those living across these aisles. The Prime Minister should be here today. The Prime Minister should pledge to stop using language that incites hatred or violence, whether that's against other MPs, citizens with different political beliefs, or migrants who've chosen to come and live and work in the UK. Will the Minister ask the Prime Minister to come before us and do that? Hear, hear.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have to say, when we look at how we reflect on creating a safe environment for debate, I'm sure many colleagues will be reflecting on exactly how that was shown in the at times online in the 2014 Scottish independence referendum. But I think what I would say is, hearing the comments that have just been made, if the Scottish National Party has no confidence in the Prime Minister, then there was a perfect opportunity offered yesterday for them to table a motion for debate to that effect today. There was also an opportunity for them to take their arguments to the country on Tuesday, the 15th of October. However, it's an invitation they declined.
The issue, that's a disgraceful thing to do. Sir Bernard Jenkin.
Speaker, there is already a danger in these exchanges of it turning into a holier-than-thou competition. And I think we should reflect on how much unhappiness and anxiety there is amongst members of the House, and that this is going to be expressed in various ways. And people are going to use robust and emotive language in order to express their views, and that is entirely understandable. May I just make one request, Mr. Speaker? That we no longer invoke the name of any person who has been a victim of attacks in order to try and make political points. Because, well, there we are. Because it is simply used as an opportunity to shame other members of this House. I don't personally think any of the exchanges and mentions of Jo Cox yesterday was particularly fair on her family.
Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's always useful to benefit from the experience of the right honourable member in this House over many years. And he's right to say that we can have robust, we can have emotive debates. The issues settled in this Parliament are matters of great concern across the nation, and rightly people will get passionate about that. But in doing so, we should not do so with disrespect. And I know, of course, if that had happened, that would be dealt with.
Swinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I would just gently say to the honourable gentleman opposite that I don't think it is for any member of this House to determine whether another member can talk about their own grief and how they feel in a certain circumstance and whether that should somehow not be allowed. The language that leaders use matters because it sets the tone for public debate. And I'm sure I'm not alone in looking across the Atlantic at the rallies of crowds of people chanting "lock her up" about Hillary Clinton or "send her back" about Ilhan Omar. And by the way, it is no coincidence that it is women that are often the targets of this hate, and especially women of colour. And see worrying echoes in our own politics of that Trumpian approach. And so I ask the Minister whether he can give any assurance that there will be no deliberate campaign to use that kind of language to inflame. But I fear he cannot, because the repeated use of those inflammatory words by the Prime Minister yesterday was, it seemed, very obviously deliberate. And I would just end by saying, Mr. Speaker, that on Tuesday morning I spoke to a group of 400 young women. They asked me how I dealt with abuse and hate on social media as a woman in public life. They asked me whether they thought going into politics was something I would recommend. I want to be able to say to young women like that and to all young people that they should play their role in public life. And we need to be able to, those of us in this House, create the environment that enables those young people to come forward into our public life, and I fear that we are failing to do so.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think we all want to see an environment where everyone feels they can take part. That's why I've already outlined some what the government's looking to do around legislating, around intimidation, around election times. And she gives some examples of what we've seen over the Atlantic. I'm sure she'd join me in, whilst I never voted for him, seeing a group of people chanting "Tony Blair can F off and die" is something that we would all condemn. I see her indication of that as well. But what actually would inflame further debate is the idea that if we just have more delay and people feel that when they do vote and do have a say, they are then ignored. That is why we do need to bring the Brexit matter to a resolution, as the government is seeking to do.
Mr. Kenneth Clark.
I was only just beginning to stir, Mr. Speaker. You spotted me rather promptly. What concerns me about all this is whether there's any sense of a deliberate strategy in all this, and I'd like my honourable friend to reassure me. I assure him I have been a junior minister myself, so I do realise he's probably not consulted closely about strategy, but I'm not sure that many members of the Cabinet have much idea of what the strategy is at the moment. But can you allay two fears I have? It seems to me that, firstly, the Prime Minister is absolutely desperate to have an election before the 31st of October, so he can fight it before the chance there is of perhaps some untoward effects after that date. And I also fear that the strategy is to fight it on this People versus Parliament platform that Nigel Farage invented and which we are now being imitating. Can my honourable friend assure me that what happened yesterday was one of these occasions when people lost control of themselves and the House, not for the first time, erupted in disorder, and this isn't part of some grand discrediting of the usual political institutions in order to fight a populist and nationalist campaign?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, as a junior minister, it's always welcome to benefit from the advice of the Father of the House. What I would reassure him is that the strategy the government has is to do what the vast majority of the nation wants to see, which is to bring a resolution to Brexit and deliver the referendum result. And I noticed, even given his own views, the Father of the House has voted for deals and seeing that as compromising and moving forward. And where the government will look to fight a general election is a platform of resolving Brexit, no more delay, pointlessly, for bringing 20,000 extra police officers onto our street, increasing school funding and taking our economy forward. And I have to say our platform will be far stronger than one opposite.
Having called the Father of the House, I want now to call the Mother of the House, Harriet Harman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable friend for bringing this urgent question, and to you for your comments last night and for your comments from the Chair this morning. I agree with the Father of the House in everything that he said, and I think that what happened last night was just an ugly spectacle of things getting even worse that have been happening for months and months. And we all know that honourable members on all sides of the House have felt inhibited in doing their work that they are elected to this place to do. It is important, it's essential, that everybody who's elected to this House is able to speak out without fear or favour to say what they believe in. And nobody in this House should do anything that stops any other member exercising that right. And whether it's threats to people who are Remainers or whether it's people in balaclavas bursting into a university meeting which was being addressed by the Leader of the House, we cannot allow that in our democracy. Nor can we have a situation where members are fearful not only for themselves and their own safety, but their staff and also their families. Now, the government minister has mentioned a number of initiatives, and heaven knows we've had enough discussion and wringing our hands about these problems over the months in this chamber. We have had a number of initiatives, but there is a lack of coherence and focus for action. And that's why the Father of the House and myself have proposed that there should be a Speakers' Conference that brings together the police, the CPS, the House authorities, the parties, and looks at what can be done to ensure that we protect our democracy. And it also needs to look at our political culture. We know, for example, that we cannot call each other blackguard or gutter snipe or stool pigeon or various other things. We need to have rules of this House that are updated and protect us to enable us to do our business today.
Yay. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I can reflect the productive conversation and meeting I had when Mother of the House was present with the Women's Caucus, when again, people should be able to speak out. I think the example given there of one female candidate being advised that the solution to the problem was to not be on campaign on social media was a completely unacceptable solution that had been advised by a local council, thinking that was the way, was that women couldn't engage in politics in the same way as men, which was a completely unacceptable suggestion. But I do think she refers to some of the rules of this House. Clearly, Mr. Speaker, that would be something that you may wish to reflect on, or whoever happens to be elected by this House to replace you may wish to work on, as well as some of the expressions used are ones that probably aren't in common parlance today and compared to other statements that are. But certainly for the government, our focus is that this isn't just about members of Parliament, this is about all who engage in public life, journalists who face abuse for what they say, and others who just want to either discharge a public duty or to share their opinion in our democracy, and we need to make sure they're covered by any proposals as well.
Justine Greening.
Thank
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think, like many people in this chamber, I was shocked by the unacceptable conduct I felt of the Prime Minister, and particularly his attitude, which frankly succeeded that of the attitude of the Attorney General earlier in the day to how this House works. And my concern, Mr. Speaker, is that these institutions, both the one that we had debated earlier, the Supreme Court and the judiciary, and of course Parliament, the place where laws are set in the first place, are absolutely crucial to the well-being of people in our country. And we all rely on them, and all of those who are part of these institutions are effectively custodians for protecting their well-being in the future. And what we are seeing right now in British politics is effectively a deliberate, in my view, race to the bottom of a form of gutter politics that I have to say, unfortunately, directly disadvantages those of us not willing to be part of that race. And I think the sooner that the leadership of the main political parties in this country rise to the challenge of showing the levels of integrity in their conduct and behaviour that the British people are entitled to expect, the better.
Yeah. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I always reflect well on the comments that are made by the Right Honourable Lady. I think what I would say is we are again, as a government, committed to ensuring that the public discourse, particularly online via the Online Harms White Paper, is not just about how we make sure that people are not breaching the law, how people can participate without fear of abuse, but also ensuring we can tackle some of the issues of disinformation, which can also have such a corrosive impact on our society. Ultimately, we do see that the social media giants have made some moves, but there is obviously a need to do even more.
Ed Miliband.
Mr. Speaker, all of us need to take care of our language, and none of us is without fault. But the Prime Minister of our country holds a special responsibility. And I say to members across this House, I spent 4.5 years opposite David Cameron. I never saw a performance like the performance we saw last night from this Prime Minister. He said this in answer to the Honourable Member for Hove. The best way, he said, to ensure that every parliamentarian is properly safe and to dial down the current anxiety in this country is to get Brexit done. Mr. Speaker, everyone in this House, I think, shares the frustration about the last 3.5 years. In fact, some of us didn't want the referendum to happen in the first place. But none of us can agree that the safety of members of this House should depend on the way they vote in this House. It is a disgrace that the Prime Minister said this yesterday. He should apologise, and the Minister should apologise on his behalf. Mr. Speaker, this and the language of surrender suggests we are at war either with Europe or with each other. Let me say, as someone who grew up with parents who were born in the shadow of war, we are not at war with Europe, and we are not at war with each other. Go down any street in this country, and there are people who voted Remain, and there are people who voted Leave. And there are people with different views about how Brexit should be resolved. The Prime Minister has a special responsibility. He is not exercising this responsibility. He is trying to divide an already divided country. Now, some people say this strategy will work. Mr. Speaker, I say this strategy will not work because the British people are better than this.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I must say it was interesting to hear the Right Honourable Member's brief mention of his parents. I remember the attacks he faced in terms of his own father and his reaction to them, which I thought took politics into a place when those attacks made was not appropriate. People should always judge members by who they are and what they say, not seek to attack their family. What I would say is that in terms of the strategy, I'm very clear when we liaise with the police and when we're talking with them about appropriate measures to be taken, that applies whatever opinion anyone takes within this House. And I suspect my discussions are more likely to focus on those who may strongly disagree with me, but have absolutely every right to put those arguments forward and to have measures in place to protect them, and not just from those things that cross the boundaries of the criminal law, but also from incessant abuse online, particularly where ill-informed. But as we all know, we did give the British people an opportunity. We wanted to give, as a government, the British people an opportunity to express their views on Tuesday, the 15th of October 2019. Sadly, for the first time in history, a government that wanted an election to resolve a matter was blocked from doing so by the opposition.
Sir Desmond Swain.
There is a strategy. The Prime Minister is the last thing standing between ending the Brexit enterprise entirely. He can expect no quarter. Absolutely everything is going to be thrown at him, isn't it?
Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think it's safe to say, as you yourself, Mr. Speaker, reflected, that the Brexit process has caused passions and arguments and debate. But I think where the Prime Minister is very clear is that his view is the way to deal with this, and the government's view is to ensure that we deliver Brexit on the 31st of October 2019.
Stella Creasy.
Speaker, the challenge with what the Minister is saying is this isn't actually about Brexit, and nor, for many of us, is this about how do we make this stop. Because actually, if we want to do that, we need to understand where it starts and how the extremists on all sides of our political culture will trump proudly about how they might stand at Cable Street to defend people's rights, or will listen to Steve Bannon and disagree with him, but have absolutely no understanding or comprehension of how we get to that Cable Street, how we get to Steve Bannon in the first place. And the danger with the Prime Minister's conduct last night is it is feeding a culture and a language that normalises extremism, so that those of us who have had traitor shouted at us in the street, as well as online, because the online and the offline are no different, experience this as the heat of the kitchen rather than a language that does nobody any favours in our democracy. And I say to the Minister, the most important thing he can do now is go and listen to what we're missing, because this doesn't affect everyone equally. We're still going to have white men of a certain age with independent means in our politics. But it is the young people, it is the women, the people from minority communities who are already saying they're not going to take part in our politics, not because they've already experienced the rape threats and the death threats and the bomb threats and the intimidation, but because they see it. When the trolls are in Parliament, how do we stop feeding the trolls?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, as the member outlines, the importance that we get the message out there that action is being taken, not just online, as we said, the law applies online as it does offline, and that actually we say to people that they have a place here, that they can make a difference, and that their votes count. And ultimately, the longer indecision goes on one issue, Brexit, the more that there will be frustrations. But that doesn't justify people crossing the line of abuse, hatred and intimidation. And it needs to be clear that the same legal standard will apply whichever end of the extreme people are. Ultimately, some people are just two sides of the same coin of hate.
Colleagues, I'll take a few more, but what really is needed is a single sentence question from each member. Caroline Noakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I fear I might be repetitive, because last night I asked the Prime Minister, my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, if it was not just about language, but also about tone. Now, I commend my honourable friend for his tone today, but how should he suggest I would respond to those in the beautiful marketplace of Romsey who 3 Saturdays ago told me I was a traitor who deserved to be shot, when the language of traitor is heard in this House?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, as I said earlier, there is no one in this House who is a traitor. There is no one in this House who should be threatened in that way, and that those who shouted that in the marketplace should realise that if they are making those sorts of nonsense and that sort of threats, that there is a criminal law they can be held accountable to.
Luciana Berger.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, our words carry consequences. They reverberate far and wide beyond these 4 walls. And the Prime Minister, who holds the highest office in our land, also bears the greatest responsibility for what he says and inspires. I don't believe the Minister can in one breath tell this House that he seeks to reduce online harm, while the Prime Minister booms out toxic, divisive soundbites, the clips of which are immediately posted and promoted on online, hate-filled social media channels.
Yeah.
We've seen the incidents of hate crime in our country increase. And as a member of this House who has seen no fewer than 6 people convicted of the harassment and the hate crimes directed at me, can I ask the Minister to take back to this Prime Minister that he has to urgently reconsider this deliberate strategy of sowing seeds of division in our country?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as the honourable member rightly points to, those who behave in certain ways will face the criminal justice system and conviction for their offences. But I would just gently reflect on the idea of a national party going around with bollocks to Brexit isn't necessarily going to help tone down the debate. And ultimately, for us all, there is, bringing a resolution to this issue is a key part of what this Parliament is meant to be here for. And if we cannot do it in this Parliament, then I'd look forward to having a mature, sensible and informed debate with the electorate that we should have been having on Tuesday, the 15th of October.
Sir Alan Duncan.
Speaker, if you were to reread your Samuel Pepys, you will find a line in the diaries of over 350 years ago which says that so low has this rump fallen in the eyes of the people that the lads in the street cry, "Kiss my Parliament." If we are to avoid that same reputation persisting today in our current politics, may I ask the Minister and all in this House to apply the same standards, Mr. Speaker, you are asking for today to our conduct of social media, and that it should include us, journalists, and the wider public if we are not to see the continuing debasement of the body politic.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not sure whether I'm going to be reducing the "to kiss my Parliament" adage again, but he's absolutely. Well, I suppose never kissed an MP. There's a new take on a famous T-shirt some people like to wear. But in terms of it, he's absolutely right to say that it's not just about MPs. It is about journalists, judges, anyone involved in public life. Some of the comments this morning we've seen directed at one journalist would hardly be seen to be as the top brow of political debate. But as I say, it is about the government's looking to create an environment that's safe for all to engage in, not just within this House, because ultimately it's that culture of debate outside this House that will reflect in the Parliament that is elected to be in this House.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Down the years since I've been a member of this House, we have had memorable and important debates on highly contested issues, on Iraq, when I remember Robin Cook's speech, on 9/11, when I remember David Blunkett's speech, on the Great Crash, when I actually remember Gordon Brown's speech. When I come into the chamber today, and I think last night was the culmination of a trend, I feel I'm coming into a session of the Bullington Club. That's what it feels like in here. And that culture is set by the leadership. It is always set by the leadership. I think that the courageous thing that the Prime Minister could have done today was to come to this House and explain to us why he thinks that leadership is appropriate. In his absence, will the Minister tell us what are the practical steps that the Prime Minister will undertake to set a new culture of leadership which brings this House back to sensible debate on critical issues and makes us the important chamber we should be?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do sometimes wonder and reflect, if we look at some of the great debates and issues of the past, how the political discourse may have been affected if things like Twitter, Facebook and social media had existed at that time, certainly going back to the 1975 referendum. But I think what I would say the Prime Minister, when the government will do, is we will continue the work we've already outlined to tackle intimidation, hatred and abuse, and also in terms of, for this Parliament, bringing back a deal to deliver the referendum and finally put the Brexit issue to bed. And I hope that's one we can look forward to wide cross-party support for.
Helen Grant.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In terms of creating more diversity in Parliament, does the Minister agree with me that this toxic, nasty, aggressive behaviour coming from all sides of the House, it just does, is something that's stopping many more women and some men from coming to this place, from feeling safe, for enjoying it, and believing Parliament is a place where they can achieve and progress and reach their full potential?
Hear, hear. Oh, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hear the honourable member's passion, and we do want to see more people coming in and feeling that they can stand, and not just as members of Parliament, but also in terms of their local council, to be an elected mayor, to be a police and crime commissioner, and not face some of the type of abuse that some sadly have faced over recent years. But ultimately also it's about people seeing Parliament as a place where things are decided, where things move on, not as a place that literally ends up going on a merry-go-round of delay, but not actually making a decision on behalf of the nation. Because that's ultimately why people stand, is to make that difference, and we want to see people from all backgrounds. I'm a comprehensive school kid, the son of a painter labourer. Not many of my type used to get into Parliament. I can now.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, I asked the Prime Minister to moderate his language, and I desperately wanted to remind him that words have consequences. And I accept that it's necessary for all of us in this place to reflect on our language and our behaviour. After all, I do accept that I have been known to have the odd heckle in here. And I'm grateful this morning for the solidarity from my fellow MPs, including many on the government benches. But last night, I was literally horrified to see a tweet from the member for Middlesbrough South and East Cleveland, and I have informed his office, Mr. Speaker, that I would be raising this issue this morning. I will not refer to him as honourable. He sent a tweet last night appearing to mock me, referring to the Labour Party as toxic, which sadly brought more abuse. The Minister this afternoon said his government wants to stamp out abuse, but how can we believe him when the Prime Minister refers to genuine concerns from female MPs as humbug? And the Prime Minister's official spokesperson this morning has confirmed that the Prime Minister has no regrets about the language that he used. So, will the Minister confirm to me that the tweet from the member for Middlesbrough and East Cleveland reflects that of the government? And will he also take the opportunity, further to the comments from the Prime Minister's official spokesperson, to say that he stands by the Prime Minister's comment that threats to female MPs, death threats and daily abuse is humbug?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Having had the odd heckle of my own speeches from the honourable member, I always recognise the spirit in which they are done, of passionate competition rather than and disagreement rather than necessary disrespect of the remarks I make. I think what I would say is the government is looking at the Defend Democracy programme, is taking action around online harms, as looking to tackle the social media giants about this issue. And ultimately, I think where I would say, as the Minister who's got responsibility for this policy area, is that actually it's about looking what the government will bring forward. I hope we'll certainly have her support in doing so when we do bring legislation forward around intimidation before an election, and that's ultimately where the test of this will be, is in what difference we can all make in terms of legislation and in tackling those who feel an impunity to abuse people online in a way they would never do on the street.
Vicky Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a sad fact that a study of parliaments across Europe showed that more than 4 out of 10 women MPs have received threats of death, rape or beating. The language that we use does matter, and the language yesterday, actually from all sides of the House, was unacceptable. We need to dial it down. I would also like to remind people, unfortunately, that the protest on the night when we last met also unleashed a huge amount of hatred towards people who had voted leave. And colleagues who had voted leave on this House have literally had to pull nails and screws out of their car tyres last week because of the threats and the language used against them. And the Liberal Democrats, sadly, are not innocent here either. 4 actions I'd like to see. 4? First of all, Mr. Speaker.
One sentence.
Mr. Speaker, please can you continue to make sure you are fair and balanced, because sometimes it doesn't feel like this. Secondly, please can all members of this House, including our front bench, dial down the language. Thirdly, please can we all work together to heal the divisions in our country, and that means respecting democracy. And fourthly, because it matters, please can we bring the domestic abuse bill back to this House?
I would just very gently say to the House, as experienced members know, there was a time when statements didn't run very long. Not many members got called. That's changed, and over the last decade, I call almost everybody most of the time. The idea that if you don't call everyone every time that they want to speak, that is somehow unfair, is so manifestly absurd that I think most of the House would recognise it as such. I do what I can to stand up for the rights of this House and honourable and right honourable members on both sides of it. I've done it for a decade. I'm doing it now. I'll go on doing it. I'm standing up for the important principle of the decency of our democracy, and I would have thought that's pretty fair. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In terms of the issues the honourable member refers to, and I'll certainly compliment the work she does as the chair of the Women in Parliament group to make sure that women can, inside and outside of Parliament, have their views heard. And yes, it is about having a calm and dignified debate, to take challenge in the way it is meant and to respond to it in a dignified way. And certainly the government is looking to work together to heal the divisions by bringing an end to the Brexit process, by delivering the result of the referendum. The longer the delay goes on and indecision, the more, sadly, this argument continues.
Dr. Rosanna Allen-Khan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was elected to this place on the day that Joe Cox was taken from us. A week later was the EU referendum. I have only ever known a politics of division in this place. It is beyond embarrassing that the Prime Minister has sent a junior minister with a folder full of rebuttals today, making every excuse in the book. So I ask this to the Minister. What does it say in your little folder about the Prime Minister acknowledging that unless he dials down the tone, unless he watches his language and adopts the position of statesperson, that the wounds that divide this country will turn into scars, permanent scars?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What I'd say to the honourable member is that actually she made the point herself, that it's been over 3 years in which this Parliament has been absolutely focused on rows and debates around Brexit. Hundreds of hours spent on it, unable to move on to the agenda that many people wish to see us discussing. And the best way to bring that to an end, to move on, is to support the Prime Minister in getting a deal to finally bring an end to this debate. And that's where I hope we'll have her support when he brings a deal back.
Mr. David Gork.
At best, the Prime Minister's answers to some of the questions last night were deeply insensitive. But the concern that many of us have is that there is a deliberate strategy of division and confrontation. Can the Minister reassure me that the Conservative Party and the government is not going to pursue a strategy of division, of confrontation, and of the undermining of the institutions that protect the peace and stability of our citizens?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What I can reassure my right honourable friend is that the Conservative Party, in going into a general election, will go forward with a manifesto that seeks to serve the country and unite the country. But a key part of doing that is bringing a resolution to the Brexit process. I know he's supported a deal, and I hope when the Prime Minister brings back a deal, we can look forward to his support again.
We have another statement to follow in a moment from the Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. There is a motion to be voted upon, there is a further debate, and so we must proceed. I regret that because I like to hear everybody. There is a moment of interruption today in a way that there wasn't yesterday. We could extend yesterday, we can't today, and I have to take account of that. So, unless there is a point of order appertaining to this particular exchange, we... Very well. Point of order, David T.C. Davis.
Mr. Speaker, could you confirm that it would be unacceptable, under any circumstances, for a senior member of this House to say of a female MP, "We should lynch the bastard"?
Yes, is the answer there. That would be totally unacceptable. I'm not aware of the particular circumstance to which the honourable gentleman is referring, but I can confirm that that is totally unacceptable. And no, I'm not going to take a whole series of points of order. Sorry, no, I'm not. I'm now going to proceed with the statement from the Secretary of State. Order, I don't require assistance from the honourable gentleman. We come now to the statement by the Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. Secretary of State Andrea Leadsom. Order. If people who are leaving the chamber could please do so quickly and quietly, we can attend to the terms of the statement from the Secretary of State. I think there is now something approaching calm. The Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm delighted that my first statement as the Business and Energy Secretary is on a subject that matters so much to every member of this House and also to every person on the planet. As we heard from a 16-year-old girl, Greta Thunberg, it is vitally important to act now so our children and grandchildren have a bright future ahead of them. We only have this planet, and it is all of our duty to do everything we can, cross-party, cross-country and cross-world, to leave it in a better place than we found it. So today, with permission, I would like to make a statement on the UN Climate Action Summit in New York that took place on Monday this week. The Prime Minister and the Secretary of State for International Development joined the UN Secretary-General, world leaders, key figures from business, industry and civil society at the UN Climate Action Summit on Monday. The science is clear about the speed, scale and cost to lives and livelihoods of the climate crisis that is facing us. Costs show that the total global damages from climate-related events were more than $300 billion in 2017 alone. And we know that globally, emissions are continuing to rise year on year. And with tragic impact, we also know that the world's most vulnerable are being hit hardest by the impacts of climate change. Natural disasters are already pushing 26 million people a year into poverty, with hundreds of millions of people potentially facing major food shortages in the coming decade. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister and other world leaders met because they are determined to take decisive collective action to cut emissions and to improve the resilience of countries and communities. And the Prime Minister showed very clearly what decisive climate action looks like at home and abroad. In the UK, we've cut emissions by 42% since 1990, while growing the economy by 72%, cutting our use of coal in our electricity system from almost 40% to only 5% in just 6 years, and leading the world in deployment of clean technologies like offshore wind. In just that one renewable sector, the UK is home to almost half the world's offshore wind power. We became the first country in the G20 to legislate for net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And we're already seeing that thousands of jobs are being created as part of this transition. Almost 400,000 people are employed in the low-carbon sector and its supply chains, a number that we plan to grow to 2 million by 2030. We're also playing a critical part on the world stage. In his closing speech, the Prime Minister set out his determination to work together with others to tackle the climate crisis. He called for all countries to increase their 2030 climate ambition pledges under the Paris Agreement and confirmed that the UK will play our part by raising our own nationally determined contribution by February next year. And to help developing countries go further and faster, we also committed to double the UK's international climate finance from £5.8 billion to £11.6 billion over the period 2021 to 2025. This funding will support some of the most vulnerable communities in the world to develop low-carbon technologies and to shift from fossil fuels to clean energy, helping replace, for example, wood-burning stoves and kerosene lamps that are used by millions of the world's poorest families with sustainable and more reliable technologies like solar power for cooking, heating and lighting. This new funding will also help our incredible rainforests and mangroves, which act as vital carbon sinks, and help restore degraded ecosystems like abandoned land, which were once home to forests, mangroves, and other precious habitats. So many of us have been glued to David Attenborough's incredible Blue Planet and Planet Earth series, which really bring home the scale of destruction and the need for global action. Doubling our international climate finance will help those most vulnerable deal with the damaging effects of climate change and to become more resilient. And, Mr. Speaker, on Monday, as a part of the international climate finance commitment, the government clearly put technology at the heart of our response with a new £1 billion Ayrton Fund to drive forward clean energy innovation in developing countries. The fund is named after the British physicist and suffragette, Herta Ayrton, whose work at the beginning of the 20th century inspired the Ayrton anti-gas fans that saved lives during the First World War. This is new funding that leading scientists and innovators from across the UK and the world can access, saving lives in the future, as Herta Ayrton's work did over a century ago. And our Prime Minister is not alone in taking action. We led on the summit's adaptation and resilience theme with Egypt and delivered a powerful call to action joined by 112 countries. As part of this, we launched a first-of-its-kind coalition for climate-resilient investment to transform infrastructure investment by integrating climate risks into decision-making, ensuring that, for example, roads and bridges are built taking into account climate risk. We also launched a new risk-informed early action partnership which will help keep 1 billion people safer from disaster by greatly improving early warning systems of such dangerous events as floods and hurricanes, giving people vital extra hours, days, and even weeks to prepare for them. Mr. Speaker, we were delighted that 77 countries, 10 regions, and 100 cities committed at the summit to net zero by 2050. We saw the incoming Chilean COP25 presidency announcing a climate ambition alliance of 70 countries, each signalling their intention to submit enhanced climate action plans or nationally determined contributions. And businesses are taking action too. Over 50 financial institutions pledged to test all of their $2.9 trillion in assets for the risks of climate change. And 9 multilateral development banks committing to support global climate action investments by targeting $175 billion in annual financing by 2025. But, Mr. Speaker, the Climate Action Summit was by no means an end in itself. It was a call for global action, one that the UK and many others heeded. We cannot and we will not be complacent. Coming out of the summit, the combined commitments of all those countries and all of that goodwill still does not put us on track to meet the temperature goals of the Paris Agreement. People right across the country and right across the world are every day sending a clear message that we all must go further. And as the Secretary-General said, time is running out. Globally, much more is needed. The UK, as an acknowledged world leader in tackling climate change and as the nominated host for COP26 in 2020, now has a unique opportunity to work with countries and businesses across the world, to build on the foundations laid at this week's summit, to drive this action agenda forward and to turn the tide of emissions growth. There is no other planet. This is it, and we must look after it. Thank you.
Thank you. Just before I call the Shadow Secretary of State, it might be helpful to the House if I indicate an intention to move on at 10 to 2. 10 to 2. Barry Gardner.
Thank you, sir. First of all, I thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of her statement. Mr. Speaker, the climate emergency is worse than we feared. Yesterday, the IPCC published their special report on oceans and the cryosphere, which set out the dangers starkly. Sea levels threatening nearly 1 billion people living in low-lying coastal regions, and tipping points in the permafrost that could release hundreds of billions of tons of carbon. This report makes clear yet again that we must do everything to reduce emissions as fast as possible to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, beyond which climate breakdown will be catastrophic. The purpose of the UN Climate Action Summit was to spur on greater climate ambition towards this aim. But none of the world's large polluters met this challenge. China, India, and the EU all were unable to announce tougher NDCs. Brazil and the USA refused even to turn up. Our country must now step forward to fill this vacuum of political leadership on the world stage. The UK's commitments at the summit need close scrutiny. The new Ayrton Fund that the government has announced allocates £1 billion to help British scientists and innovators create new clean technology. That's great. But this funding has come from the aid budget. We shouldn't be siphoning off overseas development assistance to spend on UK universities and firms. That should be funded from non-ODA finance. So can the Secretary of State explain why this funding is diverting precious resources from mitigation in climate-vulnerable nations? And if the Minister claims this money is classified as aid because it will help export clean technologies to the developing world, perhaps she can today commit to follow Labour's lead and pledge to provide to the citizens of the Global South free or cheap access to green technologies that we develop here. The government's pledge to double international climate finance, again, welcome, also raises questions. Can the Secretary of State confirm that this money will be dispersed predominantly through grants rather than loans, which unfairly saddle the poorest nations with debt in order to pay the costs of a problem that they did very little to cause? Climate change is already wreaking hundreds of billions of dollars in damages on these communities. Will the Secretary of State commit to devoting any of these resources to cover loss and damage caused by climate disasters? After all, this government is perpetuating the fossil fuel economy for the poorest nations abroad, completely undermining our international climate finance. From 2013 to 18, UK export finance gave £2.6 billion in export support to the energy sector, 96% of it to fossil fuel projects, overwhelmingly in low and middle income countries. So will the Secretary of State today commit to ending taxpayer support for fossil fuels abroad, as so many other countries have done? Because what we do abroad matters more than ever. The UK is hosting the UN Climate Conference, COP26, in Glasgow next year, the most important climate summit since the Paris Agreement. The Right Honourable Member for Devizes is president of COP26, but COP presidents are normally ministers in their government, and she has indicated her intention to stand down at the next election. So I would ask the government, what staffing resources will the office of the COP president be provided with? How much funding does the government intend to provide to COP26 preparations? What regular reports will the COP president be able to give to cabinet? And what objectives has the COP president been set by the cabinet? These resources must be devoted, because at COP26 we will need to use our diplomatic leverage to persuade other nations to bring forward much tougher NDCs. And I'm deeply concerned that staffing levels are inadequate. In 2009, under the Labour government, the Foreign Office had an army of climate staff 277 strong. 7 subsequent years of austerity halved that. When this Prime Minister was Foreign Secretary, the number of officials working full-time on climate change fell to just 55. Does the government intend to restore the workforce to levels last seen a decade ago in recognition of the huge diplomatic resource that is now required to support the agenda of a UK-led COP26? The failures of the UN Climate Action Summit raise the stakes of that COP so much higher. We cannot afford for these talks or those at COP25 in Chile to stumble. The issue of climate breakdown is far greater than the party political divides that afflict this Parliament. And I do urge all members of this House to find common ground in the pursuit of a healthy and stable climate. And in this spirit, I offer to the Secretary of State that I and my colleagues in the Labour Party are fully committed to doing everything we can in a cross-party manner to ensure that COP26 delivers the very highest possible ambition.
Well, can I thank the honourable gentleman opposite, and he and I have... Thank you. He and I have worked together on energy issues some years ago also, and I certainly welcome his willingness to work cross-party on this issue, which I know he cares a great deal about and he is extremely knowledgeable on. And I would also like to pay tribute to his right honourable friend, the member for Doncaster North, for his excellent efforts on the Climate Change Act of 2008, from which so much of the UK's ambition in this space has led. And I absolutely encourage him to work cross-party. I'll be delighted to meet with him and his colleagues to discuss how we can take this forward in a shared endeavour to tackle global climate change. He asks some very specific questions, and I will seek to answer them all. If I can't or have missed some, I'm delighted to meet and tackle them further. In terms of the recent report on the IPCC report on the ocean and the cryosphere, he's absolutely right. This report does provide the best available science on the wide range of impacts of climate change on the ocean and the cryosphere and potential measures for building resilience to those impacts. It's something that the government welcomes. We're very concerned about the impact of climate change on the oceans. And of course, as an island nation, the United Kingdom, its overseas territories, our Commonwealth partners and close friends are especially dependent on a healthy and sustainably managed ocean. So we will be looking very carefully at those recommendations. He asks about the fact that the tougher NDCs weren't met at the climate summit, and he's right to raise that point. He'll be aware that those targets are supposed to be raised by February next year. The UK is committed to do that, and we will, of course, be urging all others to raise their NDCs by next February. He asks about the Ayrton Fund and its use for scientific work coming out of overseas development aid. And what I can say to him is that in the government's recently published Green Finance Strategy, we committed to aligning all UK overseas development aid with the Paris Agreement so that all of our development finance is consistent with climate resilient and low greenhouse gas development pathways. But it is, of course, essential because so much of the problem for vulnerable communities overseas is it related to climate change. So those things are inextricably linked. But again, I'll be happy to speak to him more about that. He asks about grants versus loans. I can tell him almost all grants, and again, we can speak further about that. He asks about fossil fuel export finance, and as he will know, the Committee on Climate Change has made very clear that actually to achieve net zero does require a transition through lower carbon fossil fuels. And I would just point again to the fact that in just the last 6 years, we've gone from a 40% reliance on coal, the dirtiest fossil fuel, to today only 5%, I'm sorry. And that is quite an achievement. There's much more to be done, but we do recognise that there will be the need for ongoing use of fossil fuels during that transition period. He asks about staffing resources for COP26. He will be aware that the President is a prime ministerial appointment, and I shall be working very closely with the Honourable Member for Devizes, the Right Honourable Member for Devizes, as COP President, making sure that all of the parliamentary updates will be made available on time and working closely cross-party. And I just want to finish up by saying the UK has a huge ambition for decarbonisation and for retaining our global leadership in tackling global climate change.
Sarah Newton.
Speaker, I very much welcome the determination which the Secretary of State has communicated to us, because this is the greatest challenge that we face as a country, and I'm sure we can maintain the excellent radical consensus achieved by the member for Doncaster North through the Climate Change Act, that this remains above party politics. Everyone in the country will expect us to do that. And on the road to COP26, would my right honourable friend assure me that there will be road shows and lots of opportunities for businesses and enterprises, the length and breadth of the country, who are coming up with the solutions that will enable not only us here at home to meet our net zero carbon, but so many developing nations around the world?
Yes, my honourable friend is exactly right. It'll be very important that during 2020 we spend a good amount of time promoting not only the work that government's doing in supporting, but also the brilliant ideas from UK scientists and the efforts around the world to try and improve tackling global climate change.
Henry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I also thank the Secretary of State for advance the statement and welcome her to her position. This statement is focused on the international situation, but we are in a climate emergency. And whilst what we do abroad matters, what we do here is even more important. In Scotland, yesterday's landmark legislation passed its final stage in the Scottish Parliament. The Scottish Government has responded and now has the toughest statutory target of any country in the world to reduce emissions by 75% by 2030. Soon to generate 100% of power through renewable sources and planting 85% of the trees across the UK, pushing ahead on insulation. Scotland is committed to becoming net zero by 2045, 5 years before the rest of the UK, and in line with the advice from the UK Committee on Climate Change, whose recommendations are contingent on the UK becoming net zero by 2050. To hit the same, UK policies will therefore need to be ramped up significantly. It falls short on home and business energy efficiency. It's way behind on carbon capture, utilisation and storage. Decarbonisation of the gas grid must be accelerated. It must flatten the pedal on vehicle and tax incentives to promote low-carbon choices, and VAT must be reduced on energy efficiency improvements. Her government must remove their ideological opposition to renewable onshore wind and stop holding solar power back. The Secretary of State is new in post, so will she therefore commit to presenting a clear plan and target to address these issues? Finally, yesterday, buried amongst other news, was the revelation that the cost of Hinkley C nuclear power plant, already the most expensive development on this planet, will rise by nearly £3 billion. The UK government should not be pouring money down this bottomless pit of new nuclear, when onshore wind, for example, is now less than half the price for consumers. Will she take action on this?
Deeply grateful to the honourable gentleman. Secretary of State.
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for a raft of points. I'll try and tackle them all. First of all, I congratulate the Scottish Government for their work in also legislating to achieve net zero by 2045. And of course, they, as the UK Government are following the advice and recommendations of the Committee on Climate Change, and we will need to work together to ensure that we all meet those targets. He asks whether there'll be a clear plan and pathway for net zero. There absolutely will be. My department is working flat out to provide particular pathways for us to consult on. He raises the issue of the clean growth strategy, and I can tell him that the Committee on Climate Change are clear that our clean growth strategy and industrial strategies do provide the right frameworks for delivering net zero. So we will continue to deliver through them, including, for example, recent record low prices for offshore wind, the new Future Home Standard, our CCUS action plan, 400 million investment in charging infrastructure for electric vehicles, and 390 million for investment in hydrogen and low-carbon technology to reduce emissions from industry. Finally, on Hinkley Point C, he will be aware, I'm sure, that there is no cost to the taxpayer.
Ed Vasey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I welcome my right honourable friend to her post, and may I, through her, thank her excellent officials for the brilliant work they have done in replicating the Euratom treaty provisions, and also for her department's continued support for nuclear fusion, which is such an important industry in my constituency. Can she assure me that in her no doubt very long tenure in this new post, she will continue to support investment and research in nuclear fusion, where Britain helps to lead the world?
Well, my honourable friend raises a really important point that's very important in his constituency too, and I can assure him that my department is looking very carefully at many different innovations, including nuclear fusion.
Wait for a second.
Mr. Ed Miliband.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the Secretary of State to her post, and I know she is deeply committed on this issue, and she certainly has a big task in front of her. I want to ask her about the strategy for COP26, which is obviously a very, very important moment, not just for Britain, but for the world. We are going to be trying to persuade other countries, Europe, we're going to be trying to persuade India, China and others to ramp up their ambition for 2030, because the IPCC has told us we have 10 years to turn around the path of emissions. Can I therefore suggest to her that as well as having a net zero target for 2050, we ourselves need to ramp up our ambition for 2030? Will she therefore ask the Committee on Climate Change to look not just at the pathway to 2050, in 2030, but what more we can do as a country so we can persuade others to follow us?
Well, the right honourable gentleman raises a really important point, and he will no doubt expect that is exactly the kind of area we're looking at. There obviously needs to be a pathway. You can't just suddenly decarbonise on 2049. So we are looking now at the trajectory, at the development of different technologies, how quickly we can deploy them, what the choices are to get the best value for taxpayers' money, while setting a real example that we can demonstrate for COP26 next year.
Neil Parish.
Air quality is very much part of climate change, and we must increase our air quality in this country. So more electric cars linked to actually being charged up at night would actually use up a lot of renewable energy and store it. So there's a great advantage to driving those technologies, because we must have better air quality in this country.
Yeah. I'm grateful to my honourable friend for his question. Of course, air quality is vital, and the move to electric vehicles is very important. He'll be aware that we have a £400 million investment in charging infrastructure for electric vehicles, but also vital is that we are generating electricity from low-carbon sources to provide that electricity for those electric vehicles.
Sir Ed Davey.
Mr. Speaker, does the Secretary of State agree that the climate emergency demands we reform the whole financial system to decarbonise capitalism and green the city? If so, why is the government taking 3 years to implement mandatory disclosure of climate-related financial risks when it could be brought in within 1 year?
Well, the right honourable gentleman will be aware that the Prime Minister just this weekend doubled our international climate finance contribution from 5.8 billion to 11.2 billion between 2021 to 2025, which I think demonstrates our commitment to providing support for those in developing countries.
Anne-Marie Morris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State might be interested that it's not just Greta Thunberg, but also young people in my constituency in Newton Abbot who are absolutely determined to have a voice in this climate change issue. And they themselves, they attend Torquay Grammar School, have got on YouTube something which has gone viral, but they want to know how they can get involved. Could you tell my constituents what they need to do, how they can engage with government to have young people's voices heard?
Well done. Yeah, my honourable friend raises such an important point. There are so many young people taking part in demonstrations and wanting to know what they can do to help. We will be having Green GB Week early in the new year, and that will be a great opportunity for schools to really get involved and young people to give their views.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the commitment to double the aid spending on international climate finance, but A, it has to be new money, and B, the government has to be consistent. It makes no sense to be giving on one hand, but then investing in fossil fuels in the other. My right honourable friend on the front bench just raised the issue of the 96% of export credit finance going to energy projects, going to fossil fuel energy projects. That makes no sense at all, and she says we need a transition, but for developing countries, that's locking them into dependence on fossil fuels for decades to come. It is not a transition, so will she look into stop doing that in the future?
Well, I think the Honourable Lady will be delighted to hear about the Ayrton Fund, which is £1 billion for providing that transition from fossil fuels, as I mentioned in my earlier remarks, from using kerosene lamps and coal-fired stoves and so on, into using solar power for cooking and heating and lighting. These are a genuine opportunity for developing economies to transition early.
Alex Chalk.
Mr. Speaker, British carbon emissions are down by 42% on 1990 levels, which is a fantastic achievement, but we're responsible for just 1% of global emissions, and emissions overall are rising. What can the international community do to ensure that those polluters like India and China, responsible for nearly 30% of global emissions, clean up their act?
It's absolutely clear that this has to be a global effort. The UK, as my honourable friend rightly points out, is responsible for a small proportion of global emissions, and those emissions continue to rise. So it's incumbent on all of us to follow the instruction of the Paris climate change agreements and to try to encourage to do everything we can to lead the way, as we are doing from the United Kingdom.
Mr. Barry Shearman.
Speaker, can I urge the Secretary of State, who's a persuasive woman, will she persuade every member of Parliament, Lords and Commons, to read Professor Steve Jones' new book, Here Comes the Sun? It is compelling about the fragility of our planet and what human beings are doing to it. Will she do that? And will she also wake up the CPA and the IPU? We, as legislators, should be persuading around the world our fellow legislators to move on this, and let's share their technology with them.
Yeah. Well, I hope that the honourable gentleman isn't the manager of this particular book and taking a commission on everyone sold. Obviously, that could give me a conflict of interest, but nevertheless, I totally take his point. We need to be shouting from the rooftops, and we've got so many brilliant young people out there doing that for us, but he's right. We all need to do all we can to tackle this.
Mark Pritchard.
Can I welcome the government's commitment to net zero for 2050 whilst creating jobs, mostly green jobs, I'd like to see from the paper today. But can I ask what the government's rationale is for not agreeing with the opposition for a 2030 target?
Well, my honourable friend will realise, and here I regret to say that the 2030 target that Labour have announced is simply not credible. And the Institute for Fiscal Studies have said it is almost certainly impossible. As Paul Johnson said, we need zero emissions. Getting there by 2050 is tough and expensive, but feasible and consistent with avoiding most damaging climate change. Aiming for zero emissions by 2030 is almost certainly impossible, hugely disruptive, and risks undermining undermining consensus. So I do urge us to continue to work cross-party on 2050 zero emissions.
Ben Lake.
Secretary of State rightly emphasised the need to urgently decarbonise our economy. In that regard, would the government consider looking again at the contribution the Tidal Lagoon project might make to decarbonising our energy supply, and perhaps whether the regulated asset-based model might be a way of financing the development?
I think the Honourable Gentleman may have raised this like 4 years ago. Yes, we've been talking about this for a long time. As he will know, there have been a lot of consideration of the potential of tidal power. It is incredibly expensive and was ruled out on those grounds. We are looking at a regulated asset-based model for financing of big energy-efficient projects, and we'll continue to keep that under review. But it has to, of course, offer good value for taxpayers' money. So this path to net zero that we're setting out will enable further opportunities to consider different technologies.
Mary Robinson.
Mr. Speaker, I welcome the launch of the Ayrton Fund and the £1 billion going into the creation of new technologies. We also have a proud history of commitment to developing countries in international aid. How will this fund fit into our existing commitments?
Well, as my honourable friend knows, the UK government has committed to spending 0.7% of our national income on aid, and analysis does show that without urgent action on climate change, development progress is at risk. So tackling climate change and protecting the environment is bound up with development, so it's right that it has to be a priority for UK aid. It also is very important that the OECD criteria for official development assistance includes addressing climate change, and so that's what we're doing.
Mary McCarthy.
Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State talks about this £140 million package for protecting and restoring forests around the world, which is all well and good, but if we're still bound in to the trade in beef and livestock feed from the Amazon, we are contributing to the problem. When is she going to say something about that?
Well, as the Honourable Lady will know, that would be a matter for comment by the DEFRA Secretary of State, and I'm sure the opportunity to raise that with her will come up at DEFRA questions soon.
Richard Graham.
Mr. Speaker, holding the UN Climate Change Summit 2020 in Glasgow was a great success for Anglo-Italian diplomacy and also highlights an advantage for Scotland in being a member of the United Kingdom with some 30,000 attendees expected. I do not share the Shadow Secretary's concern about the £1 billion coming from our International Development Fund. Would my right honourable friend confirm that one of the advantages of this money is that it can be used to help to save forests in Indonesia, and would she agree with her department to continue the good work of our climate change unit there?
Well, my honourable friend is exactly right. We're all delighted that the COP26 is going to be held in Glasgow. We shall all be there. It will be a great opportunity to visit Scotland as part of a stronger United Kingdom post-Brexit. But nevertheless, we all very much look forward to it. And my honourable friend is exactly right that the Ayrton Fund offers a fantastic opportunity to contribute to low-carbon technologies for use in developing economies.
Anna McMorrin.
Can I start by saying it's good to see the Secretary of State here today in her place and allowing us the opportunity here today to question her government on climate change, which we didn't think we were going to have the opportunity to do. Data from Antarctica suggests the onset of irreversible ice sheet instability, which could see sea level rise by several metres. This was not the future my father envisaged for his children when he spent years working in Antarctica over 40 years ago, and it's not what I want for my children. So can I ask why this government is so reluctant to show leadership in setting hard and fast targets, particularly on the tried and tested technologies of onshore wind and solar?
Well, can I thank the Honourable Lady for her collegiate approach to this, and I think we should attempt to continue in that vein. She'll be aware that we have over 10 gigawatts of onshore wind capacity in the UK, and she'll also no doubt be aware that we had a very successful Contracts for Difference round just a couple of weeks ago on offshore wind, showing sub £40 per megawatt hour cost, which is extraordinary. When I was Energy Minister only a a few years ago, the cost of CFDs then was about £150 a megawatt hour. So these are extraordinary. The UK is really leading the world. We should be proud of that. And of course, we will continue to look at all renewable technologies.
Robert Hill.
Yeah, Conservative Environment Network recently produced its manifesto, and one of the proposals in there for a quick win on emissions was to increase the amount of ethanol in petrol up to 10%, which would also help the British bioethanol industry, farmers and us all. Is that something that she's looked at? Could she encourage the Secretary of State for Transport to do it? Because it would be equivalent to taking 700,000 cars off the road.
I am aware of the idea that my honourable friend mentions, and in fact what I can tell him is I'll be meeting with the Secretary of State for Transport very soon to talk about how we can speed up the decarbonisation of the transport system, and that I'm sure will certainly be something we discuss.
The right honourable ladies mentioned the involvement of young people. One of the demands of the Student Climate Network is to reform the curriculum to reflect the ecological crisis as an educational priority. Has she or will she discuss that with the Secretary of State for Education?
I think the honourable gentleman makes a very good point, and I haven't discussed it yet with the Secretary of State for Education, but I certainly will make a point of doing so.
James Gray. James Gray. No, and last time I looked, the honourable gentleman was called Luke Graham rather than James Gray. Grateful to the honourable gentleman.
Easy mistake to make, Mr. Speaker.
I say to the honourable gentleman of Ockhill and South Perthshire, he's a few years younger. James Gray.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir, but I myself was brought up in Ockhill and South Perthshire, so we have a great deal in common, albeit a slight age difference. Mr. Speaker, one way in which the UK can truly lead the world in this generational battle against climate change is through climate science, in particular polar science. And certainly I pay tribute to the Honourable Lady for Norfolk North's father, who has a glacier named after him, the Moran Glacier in Antarctica. Will the Right Honourable Lady join me in congratulating British scientists and universities and institutions throughout Britain who make a vast contribution to polar and climatic science? And will she today, of all days, pay tribute to the fact that the SS David Attenborough is today being launched in Birkenhead, and perhaps in passing make passing tribute to the great man himself?
What about Boaty McBoatface? Well, yes, indeed, Boaty McBoatface launching today, yes, the RSS David Attenborough, and I was always delighted to pay tribute to David Attenborough because I think he really, as I said in my early remarks, his series on our Earth and our oceans has really brought home to so many people the urgent need for action. And I would also like to pay tribute to my honourable friend himself because he has been a bit of an Arctic explorer and has done a great deal to highlight climate change himself, and I think we should be grateful to him for that.
Tim Farron.
Speaker, if we're serious about tackling climate change, we need to keep fossil fuels in the ground. And to that end, will she agree with me that the proposal for the West Cumbria coal mine should be cancelled? Will she speak to her friend, the Secretary of State for Local Government, to whom I have written? And will she instead commit government money through the Northern Powerhouse to create renewable industry energy jobs in the West Cumbria instead?
Well, I'm sure the honourable gentleman is as delighted as I am that we have moved from 40% reliance on coal to only 5% today, and that is quite an achievement. And he raised a very important point about fossil fuels. He'll be aware that we are looking at carbon capture, usage and storage action plan with projects designed to try and improve our use of fossil fuels and to make them lower carbon. There's a lot of work to be done in this area, and we'll continue to look at how we can make that work.
Graham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, having been part of the Cabinet Office team that pushed for Glasgow to host COP26, can I thank my honourable friend for coming through with this commitment to make sure that one of our greatest cities in the United Kingdom can showcase the fantastic commitments we're making and how we're developing world-leading technology. But it's not just internationally where we're making our name known, Mr. Speaker, it's also locally with UK government investments in the International Environment Centre in Alloa and a world-leading recycling facility being built in South Perthshire. This is great progress over the last 2 years, but can I ask my honourable friend to meet with me to take the next step to bring geothermal energy and smart grids to Clackmannanshire?
Well, my honourable friend is tempting me to make some budgetary commitments that I don't have the ability to do right now, but I'm always delighted to talk to him about his brilliant ideas for his own constituency and the surrounding area.
Idri Brock.
Our government in Scotland is consulting on public sector climate change responsibilities and reporting duties. Can the Secretary of State advise us what work her department will be doing with UK public bodies based in Scotland, as their emissions will count against our world-leading targets?
The Honourable Lady will be aware that there are regular and frequent discussions between officials at all levels on how to meet our carbon commitments. Those will continue and I would say will be increased in the road to COP26 next year, so there'll be plenty of opportunities for cross-nations collaboration.
And Dr. Matthew Alford.
It's been reported that 38% of Americans believe that we currently face a climate crisis. It's a slightly smaller number than the number of Americans that believe that aliens walk amongst us. So can the Secretary of State tell us what she's doing to actually encourage all countries to treat climate change as a priority?
Well, my honourable friend, as a number of honourable members have done, has raised the very important point about the need for global action. And what I can say is that in seeking to host COP26 in Glasgow, as we have done, we are demonstrating our determination to be part of the solution and to try to lead other nations into showing the same level of commitment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in answer to my honourable friend, the member for Bristol East's question, the Secretary of State said she couldn't answer that because it was a matter for DEFRA, which I understand. So will she join the call from the schools of Bristol and the school children of Bristol and ask the Prime Minister to bring back the Department of Climate Change?
Well, I am obviously delighted to be fulfilling the role as Secretary of State for Energy as well as for Business. I can clearly see the link between the amazing UK-led science and innovation and the need for commercialisation of many of the solutions that tackle climate change. So I actually feel very comfortable with the way that the department is now managed. She makes a very important point about the specifics of the portfolio that DEFRA holds, but I do think there'll be an opportunity at oral questions.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
Do we have a policy of using our very large international aid budget as a means of incentivising other countries to improve their climate change policies?
Yes, well, my honourable friend will be aware that in our recently published Green Finance Strategy, we committed to aligning all UK overseas development aid with the Paris Agreement so that our development finance is consistent with climate resilient and low greenhouse gas development pathways. We urge all nations to do likewise.
Liam Byrne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to follow the point made by my right honourable friend, the member for Doncaster North, because he's right to say we're not going to be a leader abroad unless we're a leader at home. Now, in the West Midlands, we've been a leader of industrial revolutions for 3 centuries, but we need a green development corporation to build the homes. We need municipal energy companies to roll out the solar. We need a regional investment bank to roll out climate finance here at home. Give us the tools and we'll show the leadership.
Well, we do have a number of actions that we've already taken around charging infrastructure for electric vehicles, investments in hydrogen, low-carbon technology to reduce emissions from industry. There's a lot more that we will be doing, and we'll be setting out our plans in the next few weeks.
Maria Caulfield.
HMRC is having to change VAT rates from 5 to 20% for the installation of renewables such as solar panels. This is to meet the EU VAT directive. Once we've left the EU, will the Minister commit to reversing this decision?
Yes, she is of course right. We will be able to choose our own VAT rates.
Order, I'm sorry, but we must now move on. We come now to motion number 1 on the conference recess adjournment. The Leader of the House to move, or a government whip on his behalf. Big to move, thank you. The question is, as on the order paper, as most of their opinions say aye. Aye! Of the contrary, no. No! Division! Clear the lobby. Question is, as on the order paper, as many as other opinions say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. Tellers for the ayes, Stuart Andrew and Ian Stewart. Tellers for the noes, Thangham Debonair and Jeff Smith.
There we go.